Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the technical meeting on covered project reporting. I'm Lex Mitchell, and I'm a section manager in CARB's Embodied Carbon program. Thank you for joining us. For those who are in the room and maybe joining that weren't here this morning, I'll just repeat a little bit of information about the building. If you need to use the restroom, you can go out the doors behind you, go to the left, follow under the glass chandelier all the way to the end, and there are restrooms and water fountains over there. If you feel the need for coffee or any other refreshment, our cafe on the first floor is open again. And I believe they close at 3, so if we go any longer than that, you may not be able to get anything there. If we do end up having a fire alarm go off, we will all go out this door, down the stairs, out the main entrance, and across the street to the Cesar Chavez Park and regroup there and wait for an all clear. We don't expect that to happen, but good information to have just in case. So moving on, this is the second part of today's technical meeting focused on the reporting framework for our Embodied Carbon program. Once again, your input is essential, and these meetings are designed to bring together subject matter experts and to foster discussion. We value the input, feedback, and time that the members of the public, including yourselves, can spend with us to inform and improve our initial concepts. And once again, as with this morning, let me cover a few logistics in case there are folks who weren't here for the earlier part. The meeting is being recorded and the materials will be posted on the CARB website. For any of you who are interested in reviewing the slides as we go, things like that, those are already all available online. And online participants may use the raised hand feature to join us during the comment period at the end of the session that we're having right now. If everyone could keep their comments brief to allow broad participation, that would be great. This morning, it seemed like we had plenty of time, so hopefully we'll end up the same way again this afternoon. There will be a public docket available for written feedback, and written feedback is very essential given the nature of this work. We really want to hear from all of you who have ideas or criticisms or anything like that in the written form, which I believe we are going to open the comment period through December 8th, if I recall the date correctly. And we'll go ahead and begin with staff presentations walking through the reporting requirements, and afterward we'll open the floor for in-person discussion and also invite comments from our online participants through the Q&A function of Zoom. With that background out of the way, I'll hand it over to Aditi Agrawal, who will be guiding us through the meeting today. Aditi?
Awesome. Thank you, Lex, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aditi Agarwal. I'm an air pollution specialist in the policy section. Our goal today with this meeting is to build upon the morning's technical meeting and introduce staff concepts for reporting requirements for covered new construction projects. First of all, we want to establish a shared understanding of the reporting framework for covered projects. And second, to present the draft reporting templates. Most importantly, this meeting aims to seek technical input from all the subject matter experts present here, both in person and virtually, to identify opportunities for improvement. On the agenda today, we'll start with the timeline of the Embodied Carbon program, followed by a brief recap of previous public engagements, which includes previous technical meetings, namely the baseline estimation held in September and the building materials reporting from earlier this morning. To provide some feedback, we will then walk through the statutory requirements for project reporting within our program and also reference related programs. We will then dive into the bulk of today's session that presents the reporting requirements, including who are the regulated reporting entities and the two reporting concepts, namely basic reporting and whole building lifecycle assessment, or WBLCA reporting. And finally, we will present an overview of the project reporting tool developed by staff before opening it up for an open discussion, as Lex mentioned earlier. To bring us all to speed, I invite my colleague Hanjiro Ambrose to present the next section.
Thanks, Aditi. Hello, everyone. My name is Hanjiro Ambrose, and I'm the lead staff in the Embodied Carbon Policy section. I want to take just to take a step back, and appears we've lost the room, I suppose, on air. We'll just take a moment so we can make sure that we're back on Zoom. I believe that shouldn't totally impact our Zoom stream. Perfect. Great. So I want to take a step back and just review a few key concepts that we presented in our prior workshops. And for those of you who were here for the morning session, likely a little bit of redundancy here. As we discussed this morning, in 2022 and 2023, the California passed the Assembly Bills 2446 and Assembly Bill 43, which directed CARB to reduce emissions from building materials in the state's building sector by 40%, based on a 2026 baseline no later than 2035. The first statutory deadline for our embodied carbon program is to adopt a framework for measuring the carbon intensity of building materials by the end of 2026. This carbon intensity framework encompasses both the baseline estimation, which we've presented in prior workshops and discussed in September, and as well as the reporting requirements that staff are discussing today. Now, the baseline quantifies the current life cycle emissions affiliated with building materials, and the reporting framework will use collected data to track progress towards greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets in future years. After the reporting regulation is adopted, the 2028 statutory deadline is to finalize a comprehensive reduction strategy. Any programs implemented that are responsive to this strategy will then help ensure that the state achieves a 40% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from building materials by 2035. We are planning to release a draft version of the reporting regulation and hold a third public workshop in early 2026 with an expected board hearing in May of 2026. We've previously reviewed the baseline estimation, and this morning we discussed building materials reporting requirements. The timeline envisioned that these reporting requirements would go into effect at the beginning of 2027. The final regulatory deadline is to finalize the comprehensive reduction strategy by 2028 and achieve the 40% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from building materials by 2035. I want to take a moment to revisit the statutory requirements that the concepts today will present are responsive to. Statute requires reporting for both covered projects and building materials, which are detailed in three key subparts of Health and Safety Code, Section 38561.3. Under Health and Safety Code 38561.3 C1, construction projects with a minimum size of 5 residential units or 10,000 square feet of non-residential building space must submit a life cycle assessment, or LCA, to CARB. In addition to project reporting requirements, building material manufacturers must also provide environmental product declarations, commonly referred to as EPDs, or other similarly robust life cycle data for the products they produce. Additionally, manufacturers of building materials are required to report data to CARB to ensure their products comply with applicable reduction targets in accordance with reporting and compliance requirements. CARB-embodied carbon staff have conducted 2 public workshops, the first in September of 2024 and the second in March of 2025, and discussed both concepts for the framework, including the baseline and embodied carbon reporting requirements. At our prior workshops, we introduced staff concepts for building embodied carbon and our initial thinking on how to develop this framework. We discussed the statutory requirements guiding this reporting system, which I just recapped, and major milestones for the program to work towards. We also illustrated staff's initial thinking on which projects are covered, who the reporting entities are, and what would be the potential exemptions to reporting requirements. We introduced 2 concepts for project reporting. These are basic reporting and life cycle analysis reporting. For the second concept, the scope of the LCA was also discussed in prior workshops. Program staff also conducted a technical meeting to discuss the baseline in September of 2025. At that meeting, staff discussed concepts for estimating the baseline and released a draft methodology along with a draft baseline assessment tool. At this morning's meeting, staff discussed concepts for building material manufacturers, including concepts for building material environmental product declarations. All the documents and recordings from the prior workshops can be found on our website with the link on this slide. Now, starting late last year, staff have been conducting an industry survey that presented an opportunity for stakeholders, including owners, builders, developers, to share information on how embodied carbon is currently quantified in covered construction projects. We published the voluntary survey on the Building Embodied Carbon webpage in December of 2024, and so far staff have received 29 responses. Survey respondents included architects, designers, residential and commercial contractors, sustainability consultants, structural engineers, and CalGreen verifiers. We encourage folks to take the survey, if they haven't had a chance to already, and share their insights on quantifying embodied carbon emissions. Staff is particularly interested in any data on bill of quantities and/or whole building life cycle assessment results for your projects, in addition to learning more about how you currently track data. So I'll take a moment to highlight some of the responses, some of the results we received from those who were able to participate in the survey. First, the vast majority of respondents said that they are familiar with environmental product declarations, or EPDs. And the majority say that they procure and select materials with EPDs. Second, over 80% of respondents track or report embodied carbon emissions on their projects. And those existing programs they report to include those under CalGreen or Title 24, the Green Building Code, Buy Clean California, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, or LEED, and as well as the International Living Future Institute IFLI certification. This slide breaks down the method used by survey respondents to track or report project embodied carbon emissions. These include whole building life cycle assessments, procuring low embodied carbon construction materials, using industry-wide EPDs, and procuring product-specific EPDs to comply with prescriptive requirements. And finally, tracking carbon emissions from construction activities, among others. As I mentioned in our last technical meeting in September, staff presented our concepts for a methodology to estimate baseline greenhouse gas emissions from California's building sector. So what is the baseline and how is it used? Well, the baseline is a profile of the current greenhouse gas emissions associated with building materials in California's building sector. Establishing a baseline is critical for two program functions. First, the baseline provides a snapshot of where emissions are concentrated in the building sector. This allows CARB to rank sectors and materials by impact and to focus reporting and reduction strategies where they matter most. Second, the baseline allows CARB to quantify how much emissions reductions would be required to meet legislative mandates of a 40% net reduction target by end of 2035. The quantity of emissions reductions needed can then inform reduction strategies in future rulemaking sessions. Importantly, the baseline is a sector-wide emissions estimate. It's not an average or benchmark carbon intensity for specific building materials. And similarly, the 40% net reduction target does not mean that each building material will have a 40% reduction in the carbon intensity. Material-specific benchmarks and/or material-specific reduction targets are a separate concept that we will discuss in future rulemaking. At our technical meeting in September, staff discussed details on our concepts for estimating the baseline. Staff have proposed have proposed a concept for using Environmental Protection Agency's U.S. Environmental Extended Input-Output model, the U.S. EEIO, to estimate baseline emissions. Conceptually, this approach allows for total economic demand for California's building materials to be multiplied by sector-specific greenhouse gas emissions intensity. The result is a statewide estimate of emissions that are attributable to building material usage in the state, as illustrated here on the slide. Now, let's turn back to our concepts for reporting requirements. Staff have discussed in prior workshops that statute defines two categories of reporting entities under the relevant section of the Health and Safety Code, namely manufacturers and importers of building materials and property owners. Staff discussed concepts for reporting requirements for manufacturers and importers this morning. And in this session, staff will discuss in more detail concepts for reporting requirements for covered projects, including how projects can report required data to CARB. As a first step, let's review the context for project reporting requirements that we will be presenting today. First, I want to discuss the context. The state has multiple existing programs aimed at decarbonizing buildings, including increasing the use of low-carbon materials in new construction projects. CARB staff are coordinating with our partner agencies to learn how this program can build upon and support existing programs. And for example, the Buy Clean California Act, which was enacted under Assembly Bill 262, applies to public works projects, and it requires environmental product declarations for eligible covered materials. Starting in July of 2024, the California Green Building Code, or CalGreen, mandated whole building life cycle assessments for large non-residential and school buildings as one of the compliance options under life cycle assessment requirements in Section 5.409. The California Energy Commission's Building Energy Efficiency Standards, or Title 24, Part 6, also outline performance and prescriptive compliance for energy efficiency. Our enabling statutes, which I've mentioned a few times here, detailed in California Health and Safety Code Section 38561.3C1, lay out some clear requirements regarding reporting for covered new construction projects. As we discussed in prior workshops, covered new construction projects include residential projects with 5 or more residential units, as well as non-residential projects with more than 10,000 square feet of total non-residential space. Now, statute requires these projects to submit project life cycle assessments to determine the carbon intensity of materials used in new residential and non-residential buildings. To provide greater clarity, staff have suggested leveraging existing approaches to whole building life cycle assessments to comply with statutory requirements for project LCA. And with that, I want to hand it back over to my colleague Aditi to present staff's concepts for covered project reporting requirements.
Thank you, Anjiro. All right. So the first key question is, who should the reporting entity be for the covered projects? The primary reporting entity is the property owner, who holds all the legal responsibility for all reporting, as outlined in the Health and Safety Code 38561.6A5. Statute also mentions that third parties that are typically associated with the installation of energy equipment may be responsible for conveying information to the state board. Thus, staff is considering that the property owner be allowed to delegate reporting responsibilities to any third party of their choice, with the caveat that the property owner remains legally responsible for all aspects of the reported information, such as accuracy, timeliness, etc. This would allow reporting entities to have the freedom to manage their project costs more effectively. In terms of the timeline, staff is considering that the covered projects report required data within 1 year of issuance of building permit. Staff is seeking additional feedback on the appropriate timeline for reporting. So here we have an example of the timeline concept. Let's walk through an example of the reporting timeline, starting with the initial 2026 reporting period, and we'll highlight when the data should be reported. So as you can see, for the 2026 period, the reported data would be due in Q1 2027 using the best available data. For the 2027 reporting period, data would be due in Q1 2028, and so on. This pattern continues, giving entities a consistent annual rhythm for data collection and reporting. Staff is considering 2 reporting concepts for covered projects. First is the basic reporting. This is required by all covered projects. Under basic reporting, projects would be required to report general information, including building sizes, occupancy types, location, and more specific information, such as the material quantities, today referred to as the bill of quantities, construction costs, and structural systems for all buildings within a project. CARB staff have developed a tool which would allow projects to estimate a life cycle project carbon intensity based off the data provided under basic reporting. This estimate utilizes CARB-approved default carbon intensity estimates for materials and other project elements. The second reporting concept is the whole building life cycle assessment reporting. Larger non-residential projects subject to Cal Green Title 24, Chapter 5, Section 5.409, Life Cycle Assessment, would be required to also report the results of a whole building life cycle assessment, or WBLCA. For these projects with over 50,000 square feet of combined non-residential floor space, whole building LCA results would be reported in addition to reporting requirements under basic reporting. Whole building LCAs reported to CARB would need to meet CARB-defined requirements and data quality standards, which would be phased in over time. Staff will go over these concepts in more detail in today's presentation, and I'll hand it over to my colleague Spencer Wright to go over that.
Thank you, Aditi. My name is Spencer Wright, and I'm an air resources engineer on the analysis team. Let's dive into the details of the basic reporting concept. All covered projects must meet basic reporting requirements. For residential projects, that means any construction of 5 or more residential units by the same project owner within a single building or single land subdivision map submitted pursuant to California Government Code 66426. For non-residential projects, this would apply to any project with the exception of those in residential group R, containing structures with a combined area over 10,000 square feet as described by the 2022 California Building Code Title 24, Part 2, Section 302, Occupancy Classification and Use Designation. Staff has considered the potential need for exemptions to the proposed reporting requirements for specific types of projects. Staff's current proposal for limited exemptions would include 1, military buildings, and 2, hospitals, as they are considered critical infrastructure. Additionally, there may be targeted exemptions related to rebuilds due to natural disaster accompanying issuance of permitting exemptions by the governor and/or at the discretion of the executive officer. The next key question is what types of data should be reported under basic reporting. The staff concept for basic reporting would require 3 main types of data. Staff's understanding from discussion with stakeholders is that these data are generally already collected by projects and are used to estimate project costs and/or are required by existing requirements such as obtaining a building permit. The first category is project information, which includes general information such as the location, various area calculations, cost estimates, scheduled construction completion dates, and more. The second category is data about each building within the project. For each building, the data to be reported includes the type of construction, what is the intended occupancy classification, what are the primary horizontal and vertical structural systems, and more. Last, we have the bill of quantities. This is a list of all building materials used in the project categorized by which building within the project and building element they are associated with, such as substructure, enclosure, and more. Additionally, it includes the name and location of the product supplier and the material cost. Here we have the exact categories of data fields that need to be reported. The purpose of collecting project information is to identify the relevant reporting parties and basic project information. Categories of data fields include the following: project reporter, property owner, and project team. This category collects contact information for entities providing reporting data. Then there's project and site data, including the location, site area, gross floor area, key dates like when the building permit was applied for and when the construction is scheduled to start and finish. Project costs collects information about the estimated total cost for the project and the source of this estimation. This set of data inputs helps distinguish between multiple buildings within a project site. For each building, the categories of data fields are listed here. Basic information includes the name of the building, when the anticipated construction completion date is, and which phase of development the building is in. Building type classifies the buildings on the basis of the intended occupancy. Additional reported data includes the number of stories, building height, enclosed parking area, and more. Information on the refrigerants used in each building would also need to be reported, including the system type, refrigerant type, and refrigerant charge. With regards to the structural system, projects would report the primary horizontal and vertical systems and risk categories such as wildfire, seismic, wind, and more. The Bill of Quantities, or BOQ, is the key piece of data staff proposed to use to calculate the carbon intensities per statute, to determine the carbon intensity of the materials used, and to evaluate cost impacts of the regulation. Entities would report details about all the materials used in the projects, primarily their quantity, supplier, and associated product costs. The data on the quantities of materials may be sourced either from as-designed data or as-built data. As-designed data may be determined from modeled information in accordance with the construction documents. On the other hand, as-built data may be established using measured quantities of materials in accordance with shop drawings, as-built documentation, record documents, supplemental records, and through on-site measurement of material quantity, or a combination of both. Note that the Bill of Quantities must include all elements of the project, namely the following: substructure, for example, foundation; shell superstructure, including floors, roof, stairs; shell enclosure, exterior vertical and horizontal enclosures; interior construction, including interior partitions and interior windows and doors; interior finishes, such as wall finishes, interior fabrications, flooring; equipment and furnishings; site work like site preparation, site improvements, liquid and gas site utilities; services, including conveying, plumbing, electrical, heating, ventilation and air conditioning, and fire protection. In accordance with product source disclosure requirements that apply to importers and manufacturers of building materials in California, as discussed in the manufacturer reporting requirements, reporting entities for covered projects must maintain records of product source disclosures for all regulated materials used in the construction of each project. These disclosures must be made available upon request by the executive officer. Here we have the exact categories of data fields that need to be reported, which include material name, supplier name, manufacturer location, quantity and unit, purchase price, building element, where projects must associate materials in the BOQ with the building elements that it is used for, installation location, where projects must associate materials in the BOQ with the building associated with the installed material. The objective of collecting this information on materials used by the project is to determine their carbon intensities. CARB would generate default carbon intensities from the USEEIO model linked to building element classifications. I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Aditi.
Thank you, Spencer. We'll now delve into the details of the whole building life cycle assessment, or WBLCA reporting concept. Staff has identified three key purposes for this reporting concept. First is its ability to inform building design. The preparation of and results from the whole building LCA should be used to inform decision-making during the design phase of a building project to reduce the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions associated with the building. Second is as a means to meet reporting requirements. Whole building LCAs reported to CARB shall report consistent and comparable results, which can support accurate tracking of emissions towards regulatory targets outlined by the statute. And third is to assess trade-offs in embodied and operational emissions. The whole building LCA should be used to assess any potential trade-offs and inform decisions related to decarbonizing the building over its lifetime. So, as a reminder, all covered projects are required to meet basic reporting requirements, while large non-residential projects would also report whole building LCA results. So, which projects are subject to this concept? Only large non-residential projects are included here. Specifically, the staff concept is that projects with more than 50,000 square feet of non-residential building space report the results of a whole building life cycle assessment. This threshold was calculated as the 80th percentile of square footage of non-residential buildings in the CIRB 2023 building permit dataset. This threshold also aligns with the performance option of the mandatory Cal Green embodied carbon measures effective January 1, 2026, section 5.409. CARB has published a complete set of whole building LCA reporting requirements and the details of the life cycle assessment approach, which are documented in the posted materials on the website, part of the 100-page documents for project reporting. We'll go through some of the key requirements in the next few slides. First, let's look at the methodology. Whole building LCA results shall have a data set compliant with ISO 14044, ISO 21930, and additional CARB requirements for EPDs, as well as conform to ISO 21931 and or EN 15978, California Green Building Code section 5.409, in addition to CARB requirements. Entities may consult the listed standards as the basis of assessment, namely ASTM E292122, standard practice for minimum criteria for comparing whole building life cycle assessments for use within building codes, standards, and rating systems. National Research Council Canada, National Guidelines for Whole Building Life Cycle Assessment. ASHRAE 240P, quantification of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of buildings, and Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, or RICS, whole building carbon assessment for the built environment. Staff recommends following the 4 phases of the LCA framework according to ISO 14040 and ISO 14044. The first phase is goal and scope definition. In this phase, the assessor defines the intended application, functional unit, system boundary, allocation procedures, LCIA methodology, and types of impacts. The second phase is the life cycle inventory or LCI analysis, where the assessors identify specific sources of life cycle inventory data. The third phase is the life cycle impact assessment. Here, the assessor assigns LCI results to the selected impact categories, also called classification, and calculates category indicator results, also called characterization. The fourth and last phase is the life cycle interpretation. In this phase, the assessor identifies the significant issues, evaluates the completeness, completes sensitivity and consistency checks, and lists the conclusions, limitations, and recommendations. A key concern when conducting a whole building LCA is the scope of this analysis. Staff is considering a cradle to grave system boundary for the whole building LCA. That would mean the life cycle stages A1 to C4, including user activities related to transportation, which align with life cycle stage B8. Let's walk through the included life cycle stages and the recommended source of data. So for stages A1 to A3, or the manufacturing stage, projects must report emissions data for all the materials, as we've discussed before. Stage A4, projects may use estimated transportation emissions provided by CARB. Stage A5, or construction emissions, projects must report fuel usage on the construction site. Stages B1 to B5, or the use stage, projects must report the estimated useful material lifetime over reference study period. Stage B6, or operational energy, projects must report the summary results from Title 24 compliance software. Stage B7, which pertains to water use during building operation. Projects may use estimated emissions provided by CARB. Stage B8, which pertains to user activities related to transportation. Projects may use estimated values provided by CARB. And finally, stages C1 to C4, or end of life. Projects may use estimated emissions from waste flows provided by CARB. In the next 3 slides, we'll go through the staff concept for various LCA aspects. First is the normalization unit. Health and Safety Code 38561.6 B2 sets forth that the unit of measurement shall be global warming potential per gross square foot, expressed in the unit kg CO2e per square foot. Further, the normalization of the GWP must be measured against each building's gross floor area as defined in Title 24. Next is the functional equivalency. Staff recommends conforming with the building occupancy classifications defined in the California Building Code, specifically Title 24, Part 2, Chapter 3, Section 302 and 302.1. For the reference study period, staff is considering a 60-year period to fully account for maintenance and replacement, and also to align with existing LCA programs across North America. Next are the impact categories. Projects must report the estimated global warming potential, or GWP, expressed in carbon dioxide equivalent units. Entities may include additional impact categories listed in the US EPA's Tool for Reduction and Assessment of Chemicals and Other Environmental Impacts, or TRACE, to comply with existing voluntary standards. With respect to verification, reported results should conform with verification requirements in ISO Standard 1930 and Title 24, Chapter 11, Section 5.409. If any carbon offsets, carbon credits, renewable energy credits, or environmental attribute crediting mechanisms are used in the calculation of the primary GWP impact estimate, primary results must also be reported without the included attributes. If biogenic carbon is included in the assessment, all emissions associated with biogenic carbon must be reported separately from fossil emissions per life cycle stage. Further, biogenic carbon stored in building materials during the building's life should not be used to offset biogenic or fossil carbon emissions. Biogenic carbon should be reported separately from the primary GWP impact results. The next key question is, what types of data should be reported? Staff is considering 2 key categories of data. First is all the information and assumptions about the life cycle assessment. This would include information about who is the assessor, which software tool was used, the LCIA method or the life cycle impact assessment method, what portion of the physical scope was included, and other inclusions like refrigerants, and also the verification process. Next, projects must report the LCA results separated by life cycle stage and building element. Third, upload the LCA report generated by a software tool in PDF format. Please note that all the required fields for the whole building LCA reporting will be submitted through the reporting tool. Additionally, projects must use CARB-approved EPDs to report global warming potential expressed in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, that is kg CO2e, per declared unit of each building material in the whole building LCA. For each material assessed while conducting a whole building LCA, the categories of data fields required to be reported include the following: material carbon intensity data source, carbon leadership forum data category, EPD declaration number, estimated useful life, and carbon intensity for each life cycle stage. Staff is also considering that when CARB-approved EPDs are not available, whole building LCAs may report results using any currently available EPDs, provided results are also reported using CARB-approved default material emissions factors. The requirement for use of CARB-approved EPDs would be phased in over time. For the next section, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Jeremy Loeb.
Thank you, Aditi. My name is Jeremy Loeb. I am a air resources engineer in the analysis section. So Now that we've walked through the basic reporting and the whole building LCA reporting track concepts, I'll show how they come together in the project reporting tool. This is a Excel-based workbook that lets projects meet their reporting requirements. I'll start with a quick overview of how the tool works, and then we'll take a walkthrough of each worksheet. You can already find the tool on the Embodied Carbon program website, along with a detailed user guide and calculation methodology. The project reporting tool uses a whole building lifecycle assessment framework to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions and carbon intensity for new construction at the material, building, and project levels. To do that, it needs project-specific inputs, things like building characteristics and the detailed list of materials that we just presented. The tool includes a comprehensive set of data fields along with built-in reference data sets and data crosswalks that are still being refined. We really would appreciate your feedback, both on the scope of the data that we're requesting from projects and also on ways to improve the accuracy of modeled results using better data sources. So, worksheets in the project reporting tool are organized by function. Basic reporting worksheets contain data fields needed for all covered projects. This includes project, building, and material level data. Covered non-residential projects greater than 50,000 square feet are also subject to the whole building LCA reporting requirements outlined previously. This requires reporting additional data in the gold-colored whole building LCA worksheets. The calculations and results worksheets contain emissions outcomes at the material and project levels, broken out by building element and life cycle stage. Finally, all the supporting data sets, calculations, and crosswalks are included. They are hidden by default for simplicity, but they are easily viewable if you'd like to explore the details. So the goal of the project reporting tool is to determine the carbon intensity of materials used in new residential and non-residential buildings, fulfilling the statutory requirements of HSC 38561.3C1. In simple terms, it links each material used in the project to the best available carbon intensity data. One option is to use product-specific environmental product declarations, or EPDs. Projects can source these from tools like Tally or OneClick, or databases like EC3, or directly from manufacturers. But we know that not every material, not every material has a product EPD. For those cases, the tool offers two other data sources. The first is US EEIO emission factors, developed by CARB, and these are automatically applied based on CSI master format codes and reported cost data. Alternately, the Carbon Leadership Forum baseline data is another data source which projects can select using the 2025 North American material baselines that they've provided for us. So together, these options ensure that every material can be assigned an emission factor, even if a product EPD is not available. While material level emissions come from EPDs, US EEIO, or CLF data, whole building categories capture other sources like operational energy and water use, refrigerant leakage, commuting impacts, and adjusted material lifespans for use or wildfire risk. To model these, we've drawn on California-specific data sets, including operational data from the California Energy Commission, commuter emissions from Caltrans, CARB, and the Institute of Transportation Engineers, water use data from the state water boards, and wildfire risk maps from the U.S. Forest Service. We are continuing to refine these data sets, and we would greatly appreciate suggestions for new sources or improvements. Next, let's take a look inside the tool itself. When you open the tool, you'll land on the instructions worksheet. It explains how the tool was designed. It identifies which sheets apply to basic reporting and whole building LCA tracks, and it summarizes the purpose of each of the other worksheets. The next sheet is the glossary, which defines key terms and acronyms. It's straightforward, but we are always looking to improve consistency with existing industry and regulatory definitions. So we also welcome your feedback there. Next up, let's look at the basic reporting worksheets, which must be completed by all covered projects. The first basic reporting worksheet is the project worksheet, which gathers general project information, including contact details, location, size, cost. In the entry column, you can see the light blue cells. These are the required fields, and light yellow cells are coded as optional. These optional fields do support internal analytics, and they help correlate carbon intensity results with other building characteristics. Next up, we have the building worksheet. This worksheet collects specific details about each building in the project, such as the building type, size, and structural system information. This worksheet also allows for multiple buildings to be reported in a single project. Each row of data entry represents a unique building in the project. You can list up to 50 buildings per project in the current version of this tool, or enter aggregate data if multiple buildings share common features. There's also some gray cells in this worksheet. Those cells indicate fields that either don't apply based on user choices or that contain calculated values. So in either situation, the gray cells indicate no entry is needed. All right. Now we've arrived at the Bill of Quantities worksheet, or BOQ for short. The BOQ is probably the most data-intensive aspect of the reporting tool because it requires a relatively complete list of materials used by the project as documented in the approved construction documents used in applying for a building permit from the concerned authority having jurisdiction, or AHJ, i.e. a as designed or as built materials quantity and cost estimates. Staff understands the effort involved in completing this worksheet thoroughly, and we are looking for feedback on how to make this process feasible for a range of project types. The BOQ records each material's supplier, quantity, purchase price, installation location, and CSI master format code. These CSI master format codes and cost data are what we use to link these materials to the default US EEIO emission factors. If that information isn't available, reporters can opt to apply a product EPD or a Carbon Leadership Forum baseline factor. So that wraps up the basic reporting requirements. Next, we turn to the whole building reporting track requirements, beginning with the material CIs sheet. The material CIs assign emission factors to each material listed in the BOQ. Every material is paired with a data source, either currently product EPD, CLF baseline, or US EEIO. Depending on which CI data source you select, certain fields become required. US EEIO is the default and requires no additional data entry. The construction worksheet covers emissions from construction activities. By default, it uses US EEIO-derived emission factors. However, projects can enter their own fuel use data in this worksheet for greater accuracy. Excuse me. To do so, you start by selecting a construction activity from the drop-down list, and then enter the total fuel usage associated with that activity. If your project does not have construction activity-specific fuel usage values, you can also enter project-wide fuel data if that is available. I will say we are exploring ways to collect fuel usage data for projects that haven't started construction. And we also welcome your ideas on software tools or processes that might help in that regard. The next whole building LCA worksheet is the operations sheet. The operations sheet uses outputs from Title 24 Energy Code Compliance software. This software is required for the performance compliance path described in Title 24, Part 6. The performance compliance path allows a building's modeled energy use to demonstrate compliance rather than following all prescriptive requirements. Currently, the 2025 Building Energy Efficiency Standards only permits a single software solution for this energy model called the California Building Energy Code Compliance, or CBEC. CBEC is the public domain compliance software developed by California Energy Commission to demonstrate performance compliance with the residential, non-residential, and multifamily regulations in the Energy Code. The operations worksheet is split into two sections, a proposed design and a standard design section. The proposed design section estimates the emissions profile of the building that is actually being built, whereas the standard design measures the emissions profile of that same building using more generic assumptions about building performance. The standard design data fields are optional, and they are not used in the CI calculations. The final worksheet requiring data entry for the whole building LCA pathway is the whole building LCA results section. This sheet records the outputs of the whole building LCA conducted for the project, following the requirements outlined earlier. Okay, now for the fun stuff. We'll look at how the tool calculates greenhouse gas and carbon intensity results, beginning with the embodied carbon emissions associated with the materials used by the project. The embodied carbon emissions worksheet evaluates cradle-to-grave emission factors, stages A1 through C4, except for stages B6, B7, and B8, which are evaluated separately as operational emissions at the building level. The calculation is relatively straightforward. Each material's emission factor is multiplied by the quantity used by the project. For the replacement stage B4, there's a bit of an exception there. We used an estimated useful life value to determine how many times a given product is replaced over the building's lifespan. For example, asphalt shingles replaced every 20 years in a building with a 60-year lifespan would count as roughly 3 cycles. There's an asterisk there because future emissions are proposed to be discounted to reflect expected decarbonization trends. For all the juicy details on those calculations, those are documented and posted on the Embodied Carbon website. Okay. The last major worksheet that we're going to cover today is the GHG and CI results. This worksheet contains 3 tables from right to left, the building average CIs, separated by operational and embodied carbon components, the total building emissions segregated by building element, and the total building emissions by life cycle stage. All embodied carbon emissions, stages A1 to B5 and C1 to C4, in the embodied carbon emissions worksheet are aggregated on a per building basis and transferred to this worksheet. A wildfire risk adjustment factor is added to each calculation per the approach described in the wildfire risk adjustment section. Additionally, building operational emissions, stages B6 through B8, are introduced in this table. Stage B6 covers the operational energy emissions and refrigerant emissions. Stage B7 evaluates water emissions, and stage B8 considers the impact of building siting on associated commuting emissions. That wraps up our brief walkthrough of the project reporting tool. We would love to hear your feedback, what features work well, what could be simplified, what data points are challenging to provide, and how the tool could work better in your workflow. Your insights will help us refine both the tool and the underlying modeling approach in future updates. I'm going to hand this off now to my colleague, Spencer.
Thanks, Jeremy. We will review the public feedback received and open it up for a discussion. As a way to summarize, staff has compiled our thinking on the various topics we have received from the public. Let's dive into each one. First, it was recommended that CARB should leverage existing voluntary efforts and industry commitments. Staff has aligned the data fields in the reporting tool with data schemas like Echo Project. Staff is also harmonizing bill of quantities data with building information modeling tool outputs. Second, staff received concerns about the varying quality of EPDs. Staff agrees that this can impair the quality of the data reported to CARB, and thus reporting entities can choose from multiple sources of data while reporting the emissions associated with each building material within the project. Staff's specific concerns and recommendations to improve EPD data quality was also addressed within the building material manufacturer's reporting scope earlier this morning. Third, staff received a variety of comments about including and excluding specific life cycle stages. Staff recommends that the entire life cycle of a project, A1 to C4, be included in the assessment. Project-specific data is only required for life cycle stages A1 to A3. CARB will assign default values to all other life cycle stages in lieu of project-specific or EPD data. Fourth, it was recommended that mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, MEP, systems be included in the assessment. Staff has included operational emissions from services like MEP, Lifecycle Stage B6, in the proposed reporting concepts. Given the limited availability of standardized data on embodied carbon emissions of MEP systems, reporting those are currently optional. Fifth, staff was recommended to separate reporting of any carbon offsets or environmental credits. Staff agrees with this recommendation and have proposed that in the project lifecycle assessment reporting concept, results be reported separated by lifecycle stages. All offsets and/or credits would also be reported distinctly. Lastly, it was recommended for CARB to accept existing EPDs to bolster the EPD market. Staff proposed to accept all EPDs that meet ISO 14025 standards for the purpose of project reporting. I will now hand it off to my colleague Hanji.
Thanks, Spencer. So we have some feedback questions here that we're some specific questions we'll be seeking feedback on. We can always bring these back up during discussion as we did during the morning session, but I'll go through them quite quickly. Does your entity already report any similar or related data for other purposes that CARB could build upon to meet these reporting requirements discussed today? How do you anticipate the proposed reporting requirements would impact the cost or feasibility of projects? How should CARB assign defaults for material transportation emissions under lifecycle stage A4? Are you currently tracking project construction emissions, commonly referred to under lifecycle stage A5? And if so, what methods do you use, and have you experienced any barriers to collecting these data? Are there additional data sources, required fields, or emission calculations that we should consider integrating into the tool to improve or enhance the accuracy of the outputs? Are there specific types of buildings, whether derived from occupant classes or non-residential designations, that would face unique reporting challenges or barriers to reporting? Are there any other barriers you've experienced that have prevented you from producing whole building life cycle assessments for projects? What were the costs of preparing whole building LCAs for your completed projects? How do you track emissions, or how do you track changes in specified building materials from the permit stage to the point of project completion? Are the changes generally significant? Can you describe general changes or perhaps submit examples to us? And are changes most common from the client, subcontractors, supply chain constraints, or what other motivations or causes are motivating changes between specified materials and as-built quantities? Should there be thresholds or cutoff considerations for materials that are reported for the bill of quantities, such as exemptions for less than 5% of the total element level 3 subcategory in cost, as one example? Should CARB encourage the submission of multiple iterations of embodied carbon data from covered projects, perhaps at different stages, such as in addition to the permit stage reporting, so perhaps at the certificate of occupancy? In particular, in cases where material quantities or cost may have changed significantly from when the permit was issued. And I think that concludes the questions. I think we'll come down and join you at the table and look forward to some discussion.
I think similar to morning or earlier this morning's session, if there's people that would like to have discussion in the room, stack your name tags end over end so we can clearly see. For folks on the Zoom call, please submit things into the question and answer feature of Zoom, and we will try our best to integrate that in a timely manner into the discussion that's taking place. Again, discussion is better suited for asking clarifying questions and having discussions around the concepts that were presented today. If what you have is more of a comment, please reserve those comments for the public comment period that will follow after the discussion period. I'm starting to see some name tags stacked, and there's a handful of questions already appearing in the Zoom queue. And so I think we can jump in the room first. I guess I have a right side bias right now, so go ahead.
Thank you. Marshall Andrews, DPR Construction. I guess my initial questions probably start on the A5 construction process. To me, it wasn't quite clear if like default values would be used for the entirety of the project, or if something that like default values established by CARB, or something like either actual values or estimates from, say, the project team would be used. Also, if it's actual values, it seems like there would be a odd like timeline where if we have to submit 1 year after permit, a lot of projects take longer than a year. So obviously there's some like time gap in there that doesn't quite align. Also on the construction emissions, looks like on the worksheet for the fuels used, there's electricity, diesel, propane, etc. I didn't see R99 renewable diesel in there, which is also required for decent portion of construction equipment that we must use. Wondering if that would be added.
Thanks. I think those are great questions. I think, we are seeking feedback on how on the appropriate assumptions there. We've provided some default emissions factors to be used for A4 and A5, but we're looking for feedback on how we should treat those data. I think another question there related to the timeline for reporting. We realize that different types of projects are obviously going to have different times of completion, right? Sometimes projects may be completed within a year, but often they're going to be quite longer after the issuance of the permit. I think that we're looking for more feedback on what the appropriate timeline is for project reporting. We do think that permit issuance is appropriate appropriate milestone to tie to because of the sort of fragmented data landscape across the state with respect to permit issuance and occupancy certificate and kind of multi-stage issuance of certificate of occupancy. So you think we want to tie things to permit issuance, but perhaps there's a better time lag that would be more appropriate, or maybe for different types of projects. I think we would be interested in hearing that feedback if there perhaps are different timelines for different projects. Now, as far as the specific data collection on construction emissions, we believe it's really important to start collecting more data on construction emissions, as we think that is a significant data gap currently within the landscape of construction projects, and as well from our observation of the limited whole building life cycle assessments that are public, additionally academic studies out there, sort of a de minimis focus on construction emissions that we think is probably not very well reflected by the data. Obviously, we'd be interested in making sure that data reporting sheet is more complete. So I think that we can definitely update it to include other fuel types as you specified. Do we want to just move around there? Jesse can jump in.
All right, thank you. Jesse Buckmaster, Hathaway Dinwiddie Construction. On the topic of data reporting timelines, I wonder if maybe like a phased reporting. So initial project information at time of, within that year of permit. A lot of whole building LCAs tend to be done when design is completed, kind of looking at lead timelines, but then for actual material quantities, doing that more tied to certificate of occupancy period, as well as the A5 emissions. I think that makes a lot more sense. There can be significant changes in scope throughout project timelines. Also, just a kind of anecdotally, in the current economic time we're in, we have a ton of projects getting permitted and then getting shelved, and construction not starting for sometimes years. So that can also drastically affect data.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I think that's a really important consideration. And like I said, we'd really be interested in getting some more substantive feedback on what calendar year of permitting or lag from permitting should be reported in a specific reporting period. Obviously, we're interested in starting to build up the capacity to have some data reported on the whole building life cycle assessment side. So I think that's definitely a consideration. And absolutely, feel free to jump in.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in and thank you for the comment. I guess what we're also seeking feedback on is the challenge of collecting data after construction, because we understand that's not necessarily readily available. So if you could provide feedback on that's like, what are the barriers you see there or the opportunities? Obviously, it's more accurate information, especially if, like you said, the project has lagged 4 years since the permit. But then again, it's like, do you still have accurate information at that time? Are you reflecting back to what was there at the design stage? So if you could give us more feedback about that, would be helpful.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in too. I do think at time of permit is good because it also sets up the contractor is going to be responsible for a lot of this information. So making sure that at least part of this is incorporated at the beginning of construction so that we are collecting during construction, because if we did tie it only to certificate of occupancy and the memo gets missed, no one's doing anything until they're done. That's a bad situation. So I that's why I'm just thinking of this like phased, like some of the information at permit, some of it later.
Sorry, follow up. So am I understanding correctly that you are recommending reporting at both times, maybe? Okay, so again, can you please give us written feedback and more kind of from your project experience? I think that'll really help us get a better sense. Thank you.
Before we jump to Jordan, there's a question online that I think we can answer, which is, could you clarify what role, if any, slide 55, for those of you that don't have slide 55 up, that was the calculated slide of greenhouse gas carbon intensity is affiliated with the bill of quantities. Can you clarify what role, if any, slide 55 plays for projects subject to basic reporting requirements? And so the basic reporting requirements does not require the whole building LCA, but we still are requesting bill of quantities as one of the basic parts of reporting. And so slide 55 shows a calculation sheet of carbon intensities. And so if you're using basic requirements and not supplementing with any additional information, that would be using CARB default emission factors as part of the bill of quantity submissions. So that would calculate carbon intensities and provide carbon intensity estimates for the project using basic data with none of the supplementary data from whole building LCA reporting. Can move on to Jordan.
Thanks. Jordan Palmieri, CLF. Wow, you folks have been busy. This is really impressive. Thank you. One observation, it seems like you've basically created a whole building LCA tool in Excel. And I am a little confused as to how people submit other whole building LCA results through other third-party tools. It seemed like, are they doing that twice, like once in your tool with all the quantities, and then it seemed like there was an opportunity to upload other third-party whole building LCAs?
Yeah, I think, so let me just clarify a little bit. I think the basic reporting requirements are data that we've heard from projects that generally are available and tracked by a project to some extent, either during the initial design phase or through the permit issuance. That does not include carbon intensities, right? The basic requirements that are reported are project information, building information, and quantity information. The whole building LCA results would then be reported. The tool is our concept for a template, which would allow you to report those data, either sets of data. The tool also includes some functionality to allow for an estimation of carbon intensity, just so that you can sort of understand the method, or so that we can illustrate the methodologies that we're proposing. So right now, the tool includes some data related to material carbon intensities, as well as the default carbon intensity assumptions, so that we can illustrate for stakeholders the types of calculations that we are proposing, or methodologies that we've proposed for estimating a project carbon intensity based on the basic reporting. Now, I think that the whole building LCA reporting would be a separate process that, as we've said in the longer documentation, you can see, we request you to report the software that was used, and what platform was used to prepare the LCA. Those outputs, the outputs of that whole building LCA, similar to the way that the PD outputs would be reported, are reported in the spreadsheet as well. And so they're kind of two separate pieces that are in the same template. So the whole building LCA outputs would be a separate element of reporting, and the outputs of those would be reported into the template. And the reporting of a whole building LCA would be in addition to what was outlined under basic reporting. Okay, yeah.
I'm working on it here. So, would a project who is subject to the whole building LCA requirement, commercial building over 50,000 square feet, need to go into the yellow tabs and select the carbon intensities of whatever their defaults are, in addition to producing a Tally or OneClick or Athena whole building LCA?
In short, yes, but not in the sense of recalculating it. But as Hanji was mentioning, the bulk of the data we are using is the BOQ, or the bill of quantities, that's part of basic reporting that everybody is reporting. And then in terms of using whole building LCA results from a different software, the challenge there, you're probably more aware than I am, is that it differs across the software that you're using, and also the way the report is spit out from that software varies in terms of the level of detail and the level of assumptions that it lays out. So a lot of the gold worksheets for the whole building LCA are essentially trying to make those results comparable, so we can get an understanding of what was the inclusion, what parts of the building were included. Because, for example, you may have, say, substructure, but it does not include slabs on grade, it only includes the foundation, or so on and so forth. So there's like various definitions of how people are conducting that and what the defaults are in the softwares also. So I think what we are asking for the data is in order to get that clarity of what exactly is happening, so that we can compare results from various sources.
And do project teams have to use a third-party software, or could they just use your tool?
They can just use the tool, because then we would be using the default CIs. So then it's also, as you illustrated, you can understand the difference of using the default carbon intensities versus assigning product-specific EPDs using current EPDs or any other method that you might use for the LCA.
Okay, thanks. I'll pass it to others.
I also think that on that, there's actually a question that is similarly related to the tool online. So I think it's worth jumping to that one, which is, can you please clarify which portions of the reporting tool should be used by basic reporters versus the large non-residential projects reporting under whole building LCA? And so the whole building LCA folks will also be filling out the basic reporting. So whole building LCA and just basic reporters, they fill out the same basic reporting requirements. And then there's also the whole building LCA subset of things. And in the tool, those are identified by yellow tabs. I would definitely encourage, if you haven't downloaded the tool, spend some time looking at it. The yellow tabs are specifically as part of the whole building LCA reporting requirement. And so on my copy of the tool that I have open, there are 3 tabs affiliated with material CIs, construction, and operations. I hope that will help improve the clarity for those online and for those in the room. I'm sure you'll have a fun weekend playing with CARB's tools.
Hi again, and thanks for doing all this work to get us to this point. I'm Raphael Sperry. I'm with Arup. Arup is a global engineering design and consulting company. I'm from our San Francisco office on our sustainability team. I'm going to take a minute to try and answer one of your questions where I can, and I do have a couple of my own because I'm here with 2 hats on. Arup holds the contract to manage the sustainability program for the California High-Speed Rail Authority, and I'm Arup's contract manager. So I'm actually managing the construction, the sustainability program there at High-Speed Rail. And High-Speed Rail is doing a very thorough job of tracking construction activity, vehicle use on all of our construction sites. And so just thinking about it, we have right now 3 active construction packages. This is when I say we at this moment, I mean the High-Speed Rail Authority. Each one probably has a junior engineer spending something like 3 days a month, say, filling out our, first we had to create a custom database called Emma. That's not just for tracking construction activity data, but also tracks other aspects of our sustainability program and the environmental requirements for the project. We collect a lot of construction activity data to comply with the a voluntary emissions reduction agreement that was signed with the South Coast Air Quality Management District. So there's a lot of reasons to collect the data, but it's a time-consuming process. Our general contractors have staff dedicated to that. We had to develop the database. Our construction managers, there's a separate construction manager for each construction package. They also superintend data on the Emma database, and then on the authority's program staff, which I direct, we validate all the data. So there's multiple. And we collect each piece of equipment. We collect its run hours. We collect total fuel use. So it's a very comprehensive data set. I'd be happy to share it with you. My personal feeling is that large civil construction projects have a large fraction of their embodied carbon tied up in construction activity emissions, and that may not be true for buildings. That's kind of what I've seen of data in the field. So the degree that this applies to, but I don't think that we're talking about civil construction, but that's what we're doing. So that was kind of what I wanted to share with you about experience. And if you want to talk more or learn more about what the authority is doing, I'm sure the authority would be happy to share that information with you as, a sister public agency.
Yeah, I think we would very much like to learn more about how you're tracking those emissions.
It's kind of a unique data source within the state of California, as far as I know.
Absolutely. And I think we've heard from various stakeholders about the challenges of collecting construction equipment fuel use. I think we are interested in learning more about that. I'm aware that a large majority of construction equipment is actually held through rental companies and contracted for use. Sunbelt, United, perhaps purchase the vast majority of all manufactured construction equipment sold in the state, it might appear. And so I think, they as entities do track, it seems, quite closely the fuel use for those equipment, at least talking to them. But it doesn't seem necessarily that data always flows down to the projects, partly because of, I think, the systems involved and the way the contracts are. But I think we'd love to know more about how you guys are doing it.
There are also, policy initiatives aimed at decreasing the emissions of construction equipment in California. There's incentive programs from CEC and from PUC for heavy-duty vehicle, zero-emission vehicles and vehicle infrastructure. So we've been tracking those. But my questions, Arup also works on other projects, as I get to as well. So like, which are more building projects like the ones you're talking about. I was kind of curious. I don't think we have time for all these questions, but on the wildfire risk side, there are other risks that you know earthquake risk, of course, being probably the best known in California. Arup published a RELI guide, which is a series of structural measures that can be taken to improve the likelihood that buildings will suffer less damage during earthquakes. We'd always thought the insurance industry would like give people a rebate if they designed above code. That's true in Japan. It's not true here. But it would seem like if we think that there's like embodied carbon is going to get lost in an earthquake, which is true, you might want to look at, you know, there's a couple of ways that people can design above code or just looking at risk of earthquakes and where people are going to suffer more damage than not. If you're thinking about wildfire, it seems like a pretty good one. You did mention the prescriptive requirements in the energy code. A lot of our clients use those. So then it seems like they would have a challenge reporting on operations phase emissions because they're not required to estimate them. They're not going to, and they don't. And then last question, which is maybe the one that I'm the most curious about, is if you've thought about how collecting this information is actually would work in tandem with applying for a regular building permit. From what I saw of the forms going by, there's a certain amount of information that's common to both, and it would be nice if applicants didn't have to put the information. I mean, we're already going to building departments and telling them a lot about our project. Are we also going to file? And it's like when we do it is you can file it any day of the year. Like when you're ready, your client always wants it sooner, but you know, you do it. So I'm just wondering, like, could there be some kind of tie-in to all of the information we have to put into building permits into this?
I don't know if my colleagues want to talk about some of the structural. I mean, I think we're very interested in feedback on these types of impacts on the building lifetime. I think this is a really, really important part of this conversation is the intersection of the expected building life, the embodied carbon, the assumed operational emissions, and the design of the building with respect to natural disasters. And I think wildfires we've brought up as a prime example of that. But obviously, there's some important structural considerations with respect to flooding, with respect to earthquakes that we should also be considered. So I think we'd very much value comments on that, on maybe how we should consider that more specifically. On the question of permitting, I think we'd very much like to get your feedback on that. But my understanding is that the current landscape for permit submission across the vast number of permitting issuing authorities around the state is incredibly fragmented, and the data collection / permitting process is very different for each of those entities. There is currently no centralized digital submission system, no centralized state tracking system for building permit issuance, no data sources that we've been able to find or identify that have any kind of statewide data. And actually there's many issuing authorities that issue permits which do not have the capacity to develop the kinds of systems that we might see at maybe a large city like a San Francisco. So we don't see that being a particularly viable path at this point. But I think we would love to learn more if you thought there was ways that might work. But I think at this point, the reporting, the concept that we've presented for reporting would be that data would be reported to CARB directly.
Just piggybacking off of the structural risk side of things. So fires, we found some methods that allow us to, what we think is put out a decent estimate that's fairly robust and accurate in terms of assessing and accounting for embodied carbon risk affiliated with wildfires. If you do suggest ways that we can implement or operationalize some of those other things, especially over stuff like earthquakes, where, as far as I know, we do not have any ability to predict when earthquakes are likely to occur over time horizons. I think that makes it really hard for us to establish, if you do add more carbon into the structure, sure, if an earthquake occurs, it's more likely to exist, but over a 60-year time horizon, something like that methodologically becomes tricky, possibly impossible to operationalize within a calculator or modeling approach. But if you do have suggestions and recommendations for how to do this sort of thing, we're definitely interested in including factors that we recognize on the ground are real, tangible effects on embodied carbon.
Yeah, to add on to that with the structural aspects, I look forward to reading Arab's guide that you guys have put together. I mean, again, looking forward to any feedback you guys might have. I mean, we're currently already considering things like importance factor and then potentially like DC ratios to see if you can get them low enough for seismic design and things like that. But any sort of recommendations you might have would be appreciated.
Are we still moving around this way? Okay. Lisa Podesto, employed by Swinerton Builders, but also a representative of Structural Engineers Association of California Sustainable Design Committee, and also the Joint Institute for Wood Project Innovation on the Board of Forestry. So I am curious about why we're collecting emissions during stages B and C if what we're trying to capture is emissions that have happened. I think those are number one, the challenge of kind of getting that data collection and like how impactful it is in stage B is one element. But also I think there's probably other more simplified ways to capture that. I mean, if the EEIO is being used for baselining for operational emissions, perhaps that's the way we're doing it. I think also from a general contracting perspective, and I don't want the general contractors in the room to hate me for saying this, but I think that it would almost be easier to report that annually programmatically as opposed to project by project. I also think it has a better incentivization to do the right behavior as opposed to, and I also think there's things that can fall between the cracks with regards to project specific emission reporting during the construction phase. So I think number one, the whole building life cycle assessment makes sense that that's a mechanism because people are already doing it. Do I think that CARB should be collecting that data? No, I don't think that makes sense. I think there's a way to estimate that without that falling on project reporting teams. I would say the phase C stuff seems like it would get reported in demolition permits and other things. I don't think the end of life piece should also make its way into the reporting at building emissions. So I'm curious why you guys are collecting the B and C specifically.
Are you suggesting that that CARB should not require any reporting of whole building LCAs, or that CARB should not require B and C? Sorry,
No, I'm saying I understand the whole building life cycle assessment assumes the full life cycle of a building, right? So that's a thing that's already being done within the industry to evaluate the best way to go about doing your building and making wise decisions. But I'm saying from a reporting perspective, why are we reporting B and C emissions if the point is to understand what our emissions are annually today, which is really what it took to build it today?
Yeah, I think a couple of pieces there. One, I mean, obviously there is a importance about the expected lifetime of materials that are used and choices that are made with respect to material choices at the outset of a building design and the expected building life. And so I think, refurbishment and replacement is important consideration with respect to material usage during the construction of the building, and so should be included in the context of the whole building life cycle assessment. Additionally, I think the important aspects of the B stage that we outlined today, and obviously we're very interested in hearing this feedback. So I mean, I think please submit, obviously we're taking notes on comments today, but we appreciate these written comments. And I think, when you think about taking a step back, thinking about what drives emissions from buildings, well, materials are obviously a very important part of building emissions from an embodied carbon standpoint. But the building design and building material selection are going to ultimately influence the operational emissions. And so there isn't really a good context to think about embodied carbon in the absence of operational emissions as well. And so I think the reason that, and obviously statute has a pretty clear requirement for projects to submit an LCA. The reason that we've included, I think, a full life cycle assessment or put forward that concept for project LCAs is in part because we recognize there's really important trade-offs potential between embodied carbon emissions and operational carbon emissions. And that without including them together, you can definitely incentivize or bake in really unintended consequences with respect to operational emissions outcomes. And I think it's really important that we include those together within the context of what are the greenhouse gas emissions for new construction projects. So I think that is part of the big underpinning of that. I think, we could talk more about the need to include some of those stages. I think we've offered some default emissions factors that could be used, for those stages, which would not require projects to gather any additional data. And it's really would be, useful for the project to just consider the potential impacts of changes that they make in the project design on those life cycle stages. And that really is there to provide that information to projects, particularly those projects that maybe aren't undertaking robust whole building LCAs. But I think, there's very strong purpose and rationale from a methodological perspective on including B-stage emissions in the context of the whole building LCA, particularly when you think about what the goal of a project or whole building LCA is.
Okay, and I just want to clarify that I am not suggesting that the B and C stage don't matter. I guess what I'm saying is, and that there's perhaps a better way to collect that data that I think actually is more important. And I would say from an operational perspective, I understand that the trade-off, but I'm saying we already have really high operational energy standards in the state that the building is going to have to meet one way or the other, right? And if they were to go above and beyond, yes, their embodied carbon is likely to also be more. But most projects that are going to go above and beyond are also going to be very critically aware of their embodied carbon impact. So they are also the projects that aren't, like that trade-off is not going to end up in the wrong direction. I think the other thing the other question that you kind of asked was, at what stage do you collect the data? And I think that doing the reporting at the design stage actually makes the most amount of sense. I think that typically your bill of quantities is going to remain very similar from that to the end. What differs is like how much information you have on the carbon intensity of the products that you're using. So I would say that I think that from a streamlining perspective, that some of the other arguments that were made for doing it at design make a lot of sense. The project is not going to go through and things like that. But I do think that it is a lot of work as a developer working for a developer that did a design whole building life cycle assessment and then tried to do an as-built one at the end. I would say there was like 2% of our projects that we were able to get all of the actual EPDs that were issued on those projects, not because we didn't try, but because literally trying to go through the paperwork and figure all that out was very difficult. And because you have the material reporting happening at the other end, it seems like that's like your check and balance on that front. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you for all of those questions and good points. I definitely would also encourage taking a look at our calculator or the tool that we released in a little bit more detail on some of the B stage things. I think part of your concern might be we didn't provide enough context or information on what that actually looks like, because when I'm hearing tracking B stage emissions and reporting B stage emissions, we're not really asking for like annual updates on like what actual usage of electricity or energy or anything was. Like a lot of that should would basically just be modeled values affiliated with generally Title 24 modeling assumptions or utilizing CARB defaults that we've provided. So it's not really much in way of like reporting too much that's new for those B stage and
I
C
think
stage.
that was not the point I was making. The point I
Okay.
was making was more that the like the B stage, meaning the construction, on-site construction emissions, were
Five.
what?
So that would be
Sorry,
A5.
A5.
Okay,
Yes,
sorry.
my bad. I think the B emissions from my perspective were like, it's projected, it's not actual, and we know that utilization matters. So all I'm saying is perhaps the better way to capture operational emissions within the state is actually at a global level, not at a project level projected.
Yeah, and I mean, CARB has other programs in place to track and deal with a lot of the B stage things, right? Like we are accurately tracking consumption of fuel and electricity across the state. So like we do have programs in place to deal with and track those sorts of things and attribute it to buildings. And this is more of on the design stage to make sure that the trade-offs between embodied carbon considerations and modeled expectation for operational emissions are accurately to the best of our abilities accounted for within the submission package so that we can understand some of those trade-offs based on modeling results with what is expected, if that makes sense. And then on the A5 stage, yeah, we would definitely appreciate more comments and thoughts on better ways to track and allow for that sort of reporting if possible. And we do have, again, I encourage taking a look at the tool. We do have some CARB default factors built in based on project properties to estimate what A5 emissions might look like.
Yeah, and apologies for those, I know that there's a lot of technical jargon and nomenclature going around, and we kind of have defaulted to this framework that we've seen that's in the construction and building standards under ISO 21930. And we reference in the documentation a few different standards that we suggest folks can consult, including the ASHRAE 240P proposed whole building life cycle assessment standard, the RICS documentation that's from across the pond, so to speak, and as well the ISO standard as well. I think we talk about B8 in the presentation today, and that's not defined in 21930, but we think is an important consideration with respect to building design. So, apologies for the nomenclature there. I think that, the recognition here is that within the construction phase itself, that there's an important aspect of on-site emissions related to installing and constructing the building, which are not included in the actual material emissions that are an important part of the embodied carbon footprint of a building. And then as well, thinking about material refurbishing, that's part of the B stage, and then the operational piece. And I think you brought up a great point that this, buildings that might be pursuing above energy code are increasing their embodied carbon to do so. And you said, well, those projects might be selecting materials or trying to select materials, maybe at the design stage, speccing materials that they may or may not be able to get, or may or may not be the materials that are actually installed by the time the project is realized, to reduce their embodied carbon to offset that operational carbon reduction as well, right? So if they're trying to pursue higher energy efficiency, increasing the amounts of insulation, using different design prospects, speccing out these materials that look great, but then actually they can't attain, how do we start to deal with that? I think that actually that potential trade-off is a really important one we want to get at. And I want to just say that seems to be a really big disparity in information in this space between EPDs and whole building LCAs. EPDs, generally public disclosures, there's thousands of EPDs in EC3. We recognize there's a limited coverage. There's not enough of them. There's not enough for all materials. Whole building LCAs, generally proprietary. None of them are released publicly. We have very few. We had industry survey open for a year. We had very few folks, although we're very excited to do so. If you're willing to share your whole building LCA results, we had very few submitted. And so I think part of the goal here is to start to surface more information in this area so that we can better understand where reduction strategies can be identified, where additional measures could be adopted or developed in the future. And because there's this big disparity in information in the space, it's very difficult for us to understand these trade-offs. And I don't think it's from a lack of expertise. I think it's from actually a lack of available data. So I think part of having a more cohesive framework for whole building LCA is to help us all, better understand as an industry and as a, regulatory agency, where those reduction strategies or reduction opportunities lie. I guess we'll keep. Oh, actually, before we move on, I'm just going to do a quick one on the online. We did talk about EPDs this morning, and so there was some connection between these things, and I hope folks can turn back to the materials online if they're interested in getting more. And then we had a question on new construction project coverage. I don't know if Aditi, you can speak to that.
Sorry, I was just answering that. So there's a question asking about submission by an entity undertaking the construction of a project. How is construction defined? Is that only for ground up construction? What if a building is partially demolished and then rebuilt? So right now, staff is considering only ground up construction, so like a new construction building, not a partial demolition or a rebuild. And the main reason for that is because statute specifically calls out new construction projects. We understand that there might be a lot of rebuild projects that exceed the threshold of 50,000 square feet. So we are open to feedback if we should be including that in our covered project definition as well.
I think we can continue around the room here. Chad?
Great, thank you. Yeah, Chad Eby, Taylor Morrison, residential builder. I think a lot of what we've talked about so far today pertains a lot to the commercial building side. And so as a residential builder, I had some questions I'm hoping you can help me out with. One is, to start off with, when we talk about the different buildings, obviously a lot of our communities will have more than 5 homes, so that makes sense. But how many, currently right now, we actually we don't have bill of quantities for our homes. The way we contract a lot is lump sum contracts that include labor, all of that. So, we don't necessarily have all those quantities broken out anywhere. So I'm curious for a community, how many of those homes as we permit would we need to try and do that for? And I mean, that it could be expensive and take a lot for us to go through this exercise, and may have to result in a total change of how we contract. I mean, this could be pretty extensive for us. So I'm just curious, if you guys have some ideas around that.
Yeah, great question. We definitely would appreciate, a more in-depth conversation to understand some of those challenges there. We also would like to kind of understand, what is the cost? Like how prohibitive are these costs? What is a feasible kind of bill of quantity sort of thing? Like what would need to happen to actually start providing those? So I think a lot of questions there help us better understand kind of the constraints and what's feasible. And ideally, we can get to something that is, will help us understand the quantities and what's actually being used or is expected to be used.
And I think, one thing we've talked to folks in the residential building space about is a question of representativeness for model homes and sort of, having some number of prototype or model homes that could be then, used to estimate that. So that is a concept that we'd heard from some residential builders. So if that, maybe if there's some kind of structure, and I don't mean structure as a pun, but structure as an implementation of a way to report that data more easily, I think we'd really be interested in figuring out how that looks. Because I do realize that, there is this, obviously even on the commercial side, the design, bid, build, and these kind of discontinuities in the data pipeline with respect to moving up the supply chain from contractors and subs. So I think on the residential side in particular, there's a reason that we're looking to align with just the non-residential mandatory measures under CalGreen for whole building LCA. And I think on the specific issue of bill of quantities, which I know is really, I think, going to be the challenge to some extent for residential. I feel like there's probably some way to come up with a representative sample of what's being built with respect to coverage. And we proposed, another question we have on here is thresholds for cutoffs. And so, we've talked about building element classification as well. I think we've proposed some different ways of binning materials by the building element, as well as perhaps if there's specific cutoff thresholds for types of materials. So like I said, if you can provide some more specific, detailed thoughts on that, I think we'd be really interested in integrating those into our proposals.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I've been talking with some of my peers and other builders, so I think we could probably get a group together to really delve into this more. So yeah, we'll table that for now. But yeah, we're really interested in providing feedback.
Hi, Webley Bowles, WAP Sustainability. I appreciate like the quick jump into all of this, but similar to Lisa, I have some really high level like why questions. So just bear with me and if I can run through them real fast. So the Health and Safety Code notes that this is about building material reporting, and the approach that you're presenting is whole building LCA soup to nuts. Energy nerd, totally love it, right? But that seems like that's kind of outside the charter. So what is the why? Why go there so deep if it's outside of the charter? I don't want to say putting the burden on the owner, but it technically is. It's going beyond what the state seems to be asking for. So that's my first question is how else can we do this research? Because I really want it to be done. The second one is about the excluded critical infrastructure. So hospitals and other really important buildings that I think we want that data on. They're essential buildings and we should understand how they compare to everyday buildings. So why are those excluded? And then the third question I have is about what is the quality of the data that you really want at the end? What is the intent? We're talking about cutoffs. We're talking about whether we're looking at the bill of materials from design versus the end of construction. Do you want to know how much was purchased versus how much was actually in the building? What was thrown away? Like, what is the quality of the material that we're trying to get at? So those are like my three big like why questions.
Yeah, so just to go back to statute, Health and Safety Code 38561.3, which y'all don't have to write it down. It's in the slides many times. C1 does talk about the submission of a life cycle assessment for non-residential buildings of 10,000 square feet or more. So we think that everything that all the concepts we've talked about today are authorized and directed by the statute itself. So, to the extent that you don't agree with that, I would suggest you submit written comments on what we're doing doesn't match with what you think the statute says. Regarding the hospitals and military installation exception, that was a initial staff concept around, what buildings would be potentially more critical to exclude there. And so if you or anybody else has comments on why you think that's not appropriate or why you think that we should include those, once again, please include that in your written feedback. And then I'm not going to talk about the data quality standard as much. I just wanted to address those two.
Yeah, so I think, thank you for the comments. Yeah, I think that's it's exactly right. I do think that, we are, as far as we're concerned, operating under statute there. As far as data quality or the data desired, I kind of tried to speak to that earlier. There seems to be a real disparity in what data are out there today. And, if you look at other markets, other jurisdictions outside the US even, there's different sort of systems in place with respect to cost estimation and tracking of material quantities, which are market standard. And I think some of those systems perhaps do provide some some examples for us. And I think that underpins we've articulated collecting some cost data on materials, partly because, we talked about this a little bit under the EPD, is that, that as a characterization factor, valuation is kind of a uniform indicator, and spend-based accounting is something that a lot of firms do, that if you are a firm that tracks through as built or as designed material use, or if you're more vertically integrated, I think spend-based accounting is something that I have heard from folks is a tool that is used by the industry. And so I think that underpins the issue of collecting cost data. That's a little bit more responding to another comment in the chat, but I think is connected to what you're asking. I think, we're open to hearing about what type of data is feasible. I think our goal is to get the best available data on the materials used in the state in covered new construction projects, right? So I think the goal of project reporting is to better understand what materials are used to complete new construction projects. Waste flows, or on-site waste flows from materials are also materials that are used. So I think it's really about what's being used to create the building sector in California, and that's obviously the goal, I think, of the reporting, at least from sort of a high level. And I think the question, the concepts we've presented today and that we've been trying to develop are trying to get at that. What's the best available data that's feasible to be reported and that isn't going to create significant burdens for reporting entities, or at least minimize those burdens in the near term.
Can I ask a follow-up? So I think the other interesting thing around this quality of the data is how the data that you're going to see between the products in the whole building LCA and the EEIO accounting. Like, I don't know that any of those are ever going to level out. Like, they're never going to 1 = 1. I can't imagine that it would. And so what is the intent to make them a little bit more equal?
Well, I mean, I think that the goal we've outlined is actually reporting under both sets of data, which I think provides an appropriate point of comparison. I think if you look at, the LCA standards and documentation, that interpretation is one of the most critical stages in the LCA and is about comparing the analysis results and understanding. LCA is not an absolute estimation exercise. It's really a comparative exercise about understanding hot spots, right? And understanding comparison between scenarios. So I think the goal here in having different, similar to having different allocation methods baked into an EPD, having different data sources into an LCA for a project is going to help have better counterfactuals. The default emission factors that we have suggested a methodology for, which is using the EEIO model. Essentially, it's not a material average, but it does represent market, right? It represents the market for those materials from a commodity level. And so I think it does help to have some set of consistent data, just as PCRs define consistent data usage to ensure that products reporting under a certain product category can be compared. I think that having additional data sources which are used across these different softwares, which use very different assumptions, will help ensure that those results can be compared to the same scale, right? Everyone will have the same ruler, so to speak, to use to compare results to some extent. And I think that's part of the rationale behind that.
I'm really curious to see into the future to see
I am
what
too.
is that gap, right? Can you just bring that up and we can get that?
Where's my DeLorean?
Angie, if I can add to it, I was going to say that, not to be redundant here, but really what we are trying to do as a statute is saying is we need to understand what's out there. So the first step is to really understand, this reporting is to understand what the emissions are out there to help us inform a strategy that gets us to this reduction target. So this whole reporting thing that we're talking today is sort of to achieve that, but to make sure we're not duplicating anything. So that was the part of the other thing is how do we make use or benefit from the existing data sources out there? So today, all the thing that staff is talking about is really to understand these are concepts, right? We're just putting it out there, trying to get your feedback, all the experts' feedback to see, this is our take based on what's out there, what we need, but you tell us or identify the gaps and other data sources that we can use. So that's really the big picture, but really appreciate everybody's input today. So I'm not trying to wrap it up.
No,
But
and this is Pamela Gupta, who's our branch chief for building decarbonization at the Air Resources Board. I don't know if we introduced. Yeah, just make sure that
I'm I'm just listening. So
should we go back? Maybe we could just
I think we should continue wrapping around the
Okay,
table.
continue
Let's just
around.
keep going around.
I don't know how to circle. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks. Joseph Shaka with Eastern Research Group. Couple of comments and questions here on the how to calculate A5 kind of challenge. And it really is a challenge. One thing to think about, UC Davis, Professor Harvey's group has been doing some work on working on this for pavements. I know it's not really applicable to buildings, but at least the concept is in terms of identifying functional units like paving or milling a lane mile of road, which I could translate into something like grading per cubic yard of mass grade, or pouring and finishing a square meter of concrete floor or something like that, where instead of reporting operational hours or fuel consumption, you could report on that term of, oh, we laid, this many square feet of concrete floor, so you can add the right data. If you had the kind of recent up or scenarios to essentially the A5 emissions associated with civic construction activities, that could potentially simplify things for the reporting community. Right now, I think it's a really challenging kind of quest to get all that fuel consumption. So just something to think about there. With that said, either whether you're doing something like that or using other approaches, just wanted to kind of flag that you are starting to see electrified construction equipment, and so thinking about how to bake that into the whole. Something else I wanted to mention, regarding Chad's comment on the bill of quantities, right? The bill of materials and the quantities. Also with that, the cost per material. And I see you shaking your head. And this relates directly to the comment from this morning about manufacturers and their ability to track the revenues because it's sort of the same thing. If you're selling and also performing the work, you might not have it's all baked into the same unit cost, like deliver and install. It's just the opposite side of that from the manufacturer's perspective versus the general contractor's perspective. So same issue, but from and then I do have one question. It's sort of carryover from this morning, more focused on sort of the EPD, CARB's kind of EPD approach, specifically related to the LCIA methodology for, sorry for all those acronyms, but to make it simple, there's what are the factors baked into how you account for like methane and nitrous oxide emissions and other emissions? And within different PCRs, they're using different methodologies currently. Do you anticipate CARB will try to standardize that around a single AR4, AR5, AR6, different methodologies? So that's just
Yeah, the last question is actually probably the easiest to respond to. So right now, Tracy 2.1 and 2.2 use AR4 emission factors, and that's what we've used in baselining approach. That's also happens to be what CARB currently has standardized on for other greenhouse gas reporting across our different programs. So when entities are reporting using the CARB default emission factors on the EPDs, that would be an AR4 standardization for global warming potential. In terms of needing to require, for all impacts, regardless, including supply chains and not on their defaults, if that should be in, AR4 or a specific thing, we're welcome to comments and entertaining that as, part of a CARB standard that we might put forward. Please submit comments and suggestions in terms of that. The other question, or I guess maybe it was more of a comment on A5 emissions reporting, standardizing that on some sort of functional unit. So in the calculator that we've released, we have created a easy calculation method, basically utilizing a default emission factor that we pulled from USEIO. And so that is based on fuel consumption across the state and then attributed to sectors. So, and specifically into the construction industry based on that. And so it is a spend-based apportionment of A5 emissions as a reasonable estimate. Is it reasonable to get a more detailed estimate than that using something like a square footage of, pavement done? I know also from John Harvey that there's a huge difference in pavement lifetime based on how much you spend time on just like packing and smoothing pavement, which clearly would not be an impact that would show up in just like a square footage kind of functional unit. So I think there are obviously concerns or, data accuracies or other difficulties in doing something like that. Whereas, just reporting fuel sales volumes or what's paid for fuel, I'm sure that data might be harder to collect, has its own, intricacies and problems. So there is no perfect approach here, and we are definitely interested in hearing more suggestions on what might work. And I feel Hanji wants to jump in. So.
Well, John wants to retire next year, so that's a barrier. Also, I think it's a great point, and obviously we talked to John and other folks who work more on the infrastructure side. I think one of the challenges too, with respect to buildings, is just the vast amount of scenarios that would be required. You think there's enough ad mixes or mixes specified by all the DOTs across different states, and then you multiply that by how many floors of a building you have, and it just starts to explode. So I think there's a big challenge there. But I think it's an interesting one. I think that the proposal that we've made is the one that aligns with what I've seen in the existing standards that have been put forward, including ASHRAE 240P, which I think has a really nice kind of way. So I don't know if other folks have put comments in or are aware of the development of the whole building life cycle greenhouse gas accounting standard that was developed by ASHRAE. That had a few open comment periods the last couple of years. But so there's been a few standards for whole building greenhouse gas accounting that have been put out, and I think we've looked at those and tried to reflect the best available approaches we see in those. But as you said, I think it's important to think about maybe streamlining ways of collecting data. I think that's why we have default emission factors we put forward, and obviously what we'd hope for is some feedback on both the methodology and the values with respect to the validity of those numbers.
Before we jump on, Marshall, there is a question that I think is worth answering that others in the room might also have that's online. If a building received a building permit in 2024 and was completed in 2026, is it subject to reporting in 2027? So the staff proposal that was put forward bases reporting on the issuance of the building permit. So if the building permit was received in 2020, well, if our program was in effect in 2024 and the building received a permit in 2024, then that would be Q1 2025. Of course, we don't have a regulation in effect right now. So a better example would be if a building received a building permit in 2026 and then was completed in 2028, would they be reporting? And so they would be reporting in Q1 of 2027, which would be prior to the completion of the building. So that would likely be as designed submission. However, we are, again, seeking feedback on some of these reporting timeframes, concepts, appropriate points for when reporting should occur.
So if you have a project that had a permit issued in 2026, you would report in 2027 projects that had covered projects that were issued a permit in 2026. That's what was proposed today. And like I said, we would like feedback on that. Obviously, there's trade-offs. As Jesse mentioned and Aditi mentioned, there's a trade-off in waiting. The longer you wait, there's a challenge with kind of creating the motivation perhaps for the project owners to complete this reporting. So it's good to probably have it at a timely fashion after the permit's issued. At the same time, the longer you wait, the more accurate perhaps the data gets. And so perhaps there are some different time horizons for different projects that might be appropriate. So I think that'd be really interesting to get some information on if folks have thoughts on that based on your own experience on the types of projects that you construct. Marshall.
Marshall Andrews, DPR Construction, on the operational energy to be included as part of the whole building life cycle assessment. I know right now the phase is just trying to get reporting together and then later phase do reductions. It sounds like part of the reason for including that is that you can make trade-offs between operational energy and upfront material emissions for like an overall reduction. However, I'm seeing nods that is the intent. However, in other reporting frameworks, like for CalGreen, like that's explicitly not allowed, where we have to maintain kind of the same energy model in both the baseline and proposed case for the building emissions. Am I off on that, or are they two different calcs?
Yeah, so I mean, we're in the reporting phase. So in terms of how that works for reductions, how things may or may not, mesh with any reduction requirements or overall targets. Great question. I think that's part of the strategy development phase at the very least, right? Statute calls for a net greenhouse reduction of 40% for building sector. And so is there, a great question is there a role for operational emissions affiliated with that in the embodied carbon context? Yeah, great question. We're not yet there, kind of in the process. But I think we have heard from a lot of folks making comments to definitely make sure we include some elements of operational emissions within the scope of whole building LCA. And so we are being responsive to those comments at this stage. We also know we've heard from interested parties, especially within insulation space, that there are concerns affiliated with embodied carbon tracking, even on EPDs, to make sure that it accounts for some of the B stage emission impacts affiliated with those things. So we do not want to cut off any of those considerations at this stage for reporting, and how it plays out in terms of strategy development, reduction targets. Great question, and we all look forward to getting to there as soon as feasible.
And I mean, just to add to that, obviously I mentioned earlier, statute also calls out this cooperation with our partner agencies, including BSC, including CEC, and we've been meeting with them consistently, and we have these cross collaboration meetings where we discuss. And so I think, there's, you noticed perhaps in the last meeting of the intervening code cycle updates that they brought up a slide regarding our rulemaking before they closed the meeting. And I think that's because that there is going to be continued conversations on potential alignment. The current, if you do the performance path under the current LCA section in the non-residential building measures, there is some prescriptive stuff there with respect to the LCA, but also it's just an attestation that it was done. There's no results that are actually reported up. The state doesn't receive any result reporting, and obviously there's no results reported to the building permit issuance authority. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in the future to probably improve alignment between these. But as we mentioned, we want to make sure that from a methodological standpoint, CARB I think has a lot of experience developing greenhouse gas reduction regulations, and we want to make sure that we're approaching this appropriately.
Hi, I'm Hank Kaplan. I'm here with the California State University Office of the Chancellor. Thank you very much to all the CARB staff. This is very, very thorough. I think a comment earlier was you've done a lot of work very quickly, and that's apparent, and it seems like good work. I had two questions, sort of as a project and property owner representative here, which, I think there's a lot of brilliant people here representing sort of the construction and design and engineering sectors. I'm more interested in sort of what and I understand that CARB is seeking this input from the regulated parties, but I'm just curious what thoughts you may have at this point in terms of technical assistance or guidance you may be offering to the property owners, particularly in light of the fact that they would be the ones that are legally responsible for the data that, the design and construction professionals provide to them. Um, and the second question I had is sort of maybe pipe dream thinking here, but in the earlier session, you guys had alluded to sort of methods 1 and 2 and something of a glide path for regulated entities that were already sort of essentially just making it a little bit easier to get towards better, more accurate, more EPDs, right? And I'm wondering if there was any thought as to potentially having any sort of glide path as it related to particularly the basic reporting requirements here in this session. Speaking on behalf of an entity that is required to comply with BuyClean, I'll be candid, and there have been difficulties sort of getting that data reliably for each and every project among our 22 campus system. And so I'm wondering if there's any thought as to how we might, sort of stretch that initial reporting requirement so that there's a little bit more of a glide path from sort of the BuyClean requirements up to what is a little bit more exhaustive as you presented today.
So to respond to your first question about resources for folks who are going to be reporting and whatnot. First, just want to clarify that as we go through this process, we're going to have more detail and we're going to end up with a regulation that we take to the board. Presumably, hopefully they'll adopt it. As with all of our regulations, it'll be perfectly clear. There will be no questions whatsoever. So really won't need anything more than that. But just in case, on the off chance that people do have questions, we regularly do things like follow-up workshops, saying, okay, let's go through, help people learn how to do this process. We spend a lot of our time in implementation of any particular reg that we put together, sitting down and taking calls from both regulated entities, environmental professionals who may be acting on their behalf, et cetera, taking feedback on how can we improve things so that, all of this is sort of in theory right now. It'll become in practice in a couple of years, and we'll learn a lot, go back, make reg amendments, do things like that. As far as glide path, I think we already did talk about one glide path this morning, which was the 2026 data reported in 2027, sort of had that little tag of best available data. I'm not sure if you were here in the morning session, but okay. Didn't mean to call you out. I'm sorry about that. So that's one thing that we're definitely already considering and open to feedback, especially in written form. I'm sure that's getting exhaustive to hear about other forms people think that could take if there's other glide paths, if you will, that folks would like.
Under the whole building LCA pathway, we also said that projects could report with the existing EPDs, provided that we also were reporting under the basic defaults to provide comparison to the results of the whole building LCA up until 2030. And that aligns, I think, with what we were proposing this morning for the EPD timeline, with the knowledge that it's going to take time to produce CARB, to integrate the types of carbon accounting principles and concepts we put forward this morning into the product category rules, et cetera, to promulgate EPDs. And so I think we're looking for feedback on that timeline. I think in particular for the overlap for these authorized projects that are under BuyClean, I think we're very interested in how we can support data availability for the BuyClean program. We do meet with our colleagues from DGS who administer BuyClean and have heard a lot about the challenges and talked to them about benchmarking that they undertake with respect to setting facility specific or setting specific benchmarks for EPD carbon intensity. So I think, part of the reason that some of the concepts we put forward this morning were in part inspired by feedback we've received from colleagues on BuyClean with respect to helping to improve the availability of data.
Great. I think we can, Jordan, did you have your card up recently or it's been there for a while? It's a new one. Then I think let's jump to some folks on this side and then we'll come back to you. Sorry to skip you. Okay.
Okay, we're going to go to Reed. So
Reed.
he had his first up and then go back.
Caught me off guard.
The
Saw
queue.
all those flags up. This is probably a naive sort of big picture question, but I do want to ask it. And I think you guys touched on this morning briefly. But I'm listening to the references to other entities such as CEC and Building Standards Commission, what have you. And I'm interested in what your perspective is on how your program will interact with the passage of AB 130, and how are those interconnected, and what is sort of the interplay on those?
Apologies. So AB 130 suspended some building code updates except for relation to fire issues and as well as emergency authorizations. So essentially, I think, there was a recent, intervening code cycle update and there was workshops held. And I think that the Building Standards Commission did a good job of communicating their intentions with respect to potential updates on this recent intervening code cycle update, as well as future code cycle updates. Obviously, that agency, the Building Standards Commission, will, continue to develop their proposals, and we work with them and talk to them and try to stay abreast of what's happening. I think in the long run, we intend to continue to coordinate with them. I think there's interest, I think, across our partner agencies in aligning. But I think right now, the focus here is on a CARB specific reporting requirement. The building code updates are wholly separate to some extent from a regulatory perspective, different sections of code, different books to some extent, right? Health and safety code, CCR. So I think, all paths in the future maybe, bend together. But I think in the near term, these are really separate, regulatory issues, and the passage of that assembly bill didn't necessarily have any impact because this is not a building code update. Additionally, important to consider that the reporting regulations we're proposing, the concepts we proposed, would not impact the timeline for any permit issuance or building completion. Right, we're asking for reporting data that comes after a permit's issued. There's no reason we suspect that reporting should impede the progress of the project or completion of the project. And so this is not something that I think is same in the way that building code is kind of a hard line in the sand with respect to proceeding on a project completion. So I think there is a pretty clear distinction there between the reporting we're talking about and the requirements of the building code. Okay. Maybe we could just go back. It's easier to go in order, I feel like, than to jump around, if that's okay, Taylor. Then, I mean, well, Lisa had to think about it. Yeah, we just move.
Thank you. Taylor with Built Cold. Really loving this because jumping from policy to practice is a huge opportunity to get right and can improve iteratively. And in a lot of ways, we sit in between the agencies and the industry trying to execute these buy clean or kind of embodied carbon policies. And when I hear all this amazing conversation, I'm always curious, like, what is the actual going to be the decisions you're trying to drive with this data? And I know that's a subsequent phase of the process, but you're gathering data today to then inform the strategy and then the incentives of the mandates in the future. And something that we've just seen being on the ground is, in the current staff concept, there's no A4 inclusion. And A4 has become a really hot topic now with our agency partners, as well as our industry partners of how that can impact green procurement decisions if you're using a GWP threshold that is derived from A4. And so I think it would help, I think maybe it's just a comment then, better understanding the end game of will these incentives or mandates be based on a whole building life cycle assessment with an overall reduction target? Is it going to be based on a carbon budget? Is it going to be based on material substitution incentives? Because otherwise, what you're tracking today could have adverse effects when the incentives come to market.
Yeah, that seems like a great comment, and we encourage you to also submit something a little bit more detailed in writing. Thank you. Lisa.
Yeah, I have a question. I know that you guys decided on the EEIO approach for baselining. And I'm curious if that's going to give you what we think our current emission status is, cumulative emission. But the data you're collecting is from the ground up. How are you measuring your success to the 40% target against data that doesn't match? Are you going to, in 2040, redo an EEIO, or I guess that's my question that has a follow-up, that will have a follow-up.
Yeah, so good question. A lot of the reporting data is going to be used to track progress affiliated with reporting entities and what is reported. The baseline is a point-in-time estimate that will help us identify strategy moving forward. It doesn't necessarily mean that we will or should repeat the USDIO methodology in year 2028, in year 2030, to actually reassess that. I think it's more of developing a plan to move forward and concepts to see how different programs, different policies fit together and help us achieve an overall 40% reduction. So it more links into strategy planning and modeling activities. And then the reporting data is where we actually see on the ground progress in terms of what is being reported. And so that will be apples to apples from reporting. And the baseline number is really what we use to start developing strategies and moving forward on assessing what we maybe need to implement for policies and how existing policies help us align with that target.
Okay, so I'm going to clarify. So you're saying that the 40% reduction won't be measured based on the baseline, like your progress in 2040. It will be based on the first year of reporting and the second year of reporting, and that you've been able to demonstrate 40% reduction off of year one.
Yeah, we would like to use the reported data to help inform how progress is going and to measure the progress. I mean, what does that mean in terms of, so we get best available data in 2026, quantity data, is not going to be complete. There are definitely a lot of methodological considerations for how we use the reported data to actually even track progress among data that is reported. And so that we will work out and start figuring out as we get to the strategy development, and then any resulting regulatory actions that follow the strategy development phase.
And I think we've tried to be really clear about saying that the intention of the reporting concepts, the concepts for reporting regulation, is to be able to track progress eventually towards reduction regulation. I mean, I think that we've said that in a few slides. I mean, that is the goal of the reporting data. And the goal of the baseline as well, we've tried to be clear about. And it's a point-in-time estimate of GHG emissions from the California's building sector. It's going to inform our strategy developments. It's informing the prioritization of reporting, and as well as our understanding of what the magnitude of reductions required to achieve a percentage reduction. But it isn't the targets, right? We need to develop those, and those will come through the strategy that we will eventually develop. And as well, the reason that we're kind of putting forward these concepts for reporting is to ensure that we can, in the future, accurately track reductions, knowing that we haven't well identified where reduction opportunities all are yet. And I think partly, I've tried to say today, I think there's a lot of gaps currently in the data in the space, particularly on the building side, that I think the reporting regulation is kind of trying to get ahead of. It's trying to do multiple things, right? It's trying to future-proof tracking while also addressing data gaps, so that we can better understand where reduction strategies are.
So I guess the follow-up question is, what level of accuracy are you expecting with regards to measurement? So, if I'm sure there's like an error, a percentage of error based on the reported information that you're being given and that tracking. And I guess where that question is going is that same percentage of error, could we, in our data collection, could we accommodate for that same level of error or something similar? Because perhaps like a lot of the data that you're asking for is very granular and very like, and I think it responds to the question of like whether you could collect it at design or whether you need to wait till construction, because what level of accuracy delta is that? And does it necessitate, if the level of accuracy that you anticipate is not within, plus or minus 1 or 2%, then perhaps you can handle that same level of accuracy with the data collection that you're asking for. And I know that accuracy compound, like the level of accuracy compounds, but and I think the other concern that I have is I feel like you guys are, in some ways, I'm maybe I'm misinterpreting, but if what we're doing is measuring the cumulative emissions in the atmosphere that California is contributing to, then and it matters from year to year, then why would your statute currently be suggesting collecting the data at permit, which actually I think is a better idea, but the emissions may not actually be fully emitted for 2 years, because the course of construction from permit to certificate of occupancy could be that 2 years. And I think that same comment is like considering the emissions. Perhaps you're collecting the data on emissions at end of life, but those aren't going to get factored into the actual emitted data, right? Emission data. But like that hasn't happened and it won't happen for 60 years. So I think those are the things I'm trying to grapple with: the level of accuracy that you're asking for versus what you anticipate, and then also like temporally being accurate.
Yeah, definitely a lot of good questions. Also, some comments probably in there. I would encourage, submitting something that's a little bit more fleshed out, also in writing. In terms of the accuracy question, and errors and approaches for estimation and these sorts of things. Yeah, I mean that's also why reporting is very important, because there isn't very good data on this stuff now, and so we are hoping to actually remedy one of those gaps and get data so that we can be more accurate and not have, plus or minus 50% estimates or something for greenhouse gas emissions. So real data of things that occur on the ground is ideal from a actually tracking emissions perspective. I also think that on the project side, with how we deal with the time lags and other things, keep in mind that project reporting is only one part of the program. We're getting quantities and carbon intensities on a fairly updated, frequent annual basis from manufacturers. And so that does reflect temporally consistent emission reductions pretty accurately. And then, of course, there is the component of, so how does that map onto what was used for buildings that were constructed versus when buildings were permitted? And those are some really good questions that we have not yet dealt with, because that does come down to a lot of strategy questions on. So now that you have this data, what should be reduced and how do you track those reductions? And so how do we use the data that we're collecting to track the reductions that we think are the reductions that, we've identified in the strategy, right? And there's definitely different ways to do that. We're hoping, as Hanjiro laid out, we are trying to get reporting to help future-proof against this strategy development phase. And so it's really important for us to, make sure that we have a robust framework for collecting and reporting data that will help us reduce emissions as defined and developed through the strategy. Did that satisfy your main query? Okay, great.
I just because you might use it, I think that's what I think the resistance is in the industry, right? Is like collect data that we know that will be useful, but like collecting all of it because why not?
Well,
Kind of the wrong way to
yeah,
go
I
about it.
think I want to just respond to that a little bit because I heard that comment in what you said previously, and just with respect to timeline, thinking about this time horizon, right? It is a complex topic, and I'd be happy to go after this, and we can sit down and talk about greenhouse gas accounting and time-corrected adjustment for warming factors, and the long time horizon for thinking about accounting for greenhouse gases. But I think that the standards, the kind of principles that we've put out, or these principles we proposed, are pretty well established across the kind of scientific literature for understanding greenhouse gas emissions accounting. So that's underpins this long time horizon. I think just with respect to the data reporting, it isn't about fishing or taking data or asking for data that we're not going to use. It's actually we've thought, I think, as staff, very carefully and methodically about what are the key data gaps and where are the key reduction strategies that we already understand are important to building design, to material manufacturing from an industrial decarbonization standpoint, and to the types of strategies that we're aware that current projects are undertaking to reduce their emissions. And the data, the concepts, and as I think we've all stressed today, these are concepts we're putting forward because we're looking for feedback. I think the concepts that we've put out are really based in ensuring that we're collecting data on these really important levers. I don't think anybody in the room is going to argue that building operations emissions and trade-offs in embodied carbon is not an important piece of this, or that material emissions are not a significant driver, or that construction emissions is not a significant data gap. I think these are all well identified across the industry, and I think the limited results we receive from our industry survey also validate that. So the data that we have the proposed data requirements, I think are really based in a very careful approach to understanding a method for data collection that both addresses the data gaps and ensures that we can track progress towards reduction strategies that I understand we need to do a lot more work to flesh out. And unfortunately, because of kind of the way that we approach regulatory development, we kind of need to take some time to do in multiple steps. But because of the goals of statute, it's really important that we try to meet the reporting requirements as soon as possible. We've proposed some concepts for reporting that have multiple options to ensure that there are, the paths of least resistance, right? Feasible pathways towards reporting data. But everything that we've asked for with respect to data reporting is based in a lot of work with respect to development of a purpose and rationale for collection of all that data. And I don't think any of the data fields is a question of maybe this is useful. I think it's all we've tried, both from with our own team and through outreach to understand what the data gaps are, to understand well where potential reduction strategies are currently being pursued by the industry, and ensure that in the data collection that we're requesting is really targeted at those specific items.
I think we can take Jordan real quick, and then we should move into the comment period, and then we should wrap, if that's okay with everyone.
Great, thanks. Jordan from CLF. I have two questions. Number one is, how are salvaged and reused materials being addressed in project reporting? And then the second question is that I'd like to hear some of CARB's thoughts on the alignment materials between manufacturer reporting and then project reporting. One thing I noticed is that there's a lot of different materials and building elements being covered in project reporting, and that's can be both burdensome but also opportunistic, right? And that we've noticed, and as we grow our understanding of embodied carbon, things like the existing building stock, things like material replacements, make materials like interiors or flooring, a lot more important. And I noticed those are materials that aren't included in the manufacturer reporting. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more thinking about how these two overlap, and if there's been more thought to adding additional manufacturer reporting, not as, in more of an opportunity way. Well, if there is more opportunity in the total embodied carbon sector, I realize that this covers new building construction, but that doesn't mean that you can't get your reductions from other places like replacement materials. So wanted to hear a little bit about that.
I don't know if Didi, you want to talk about that, the first question in particular, I think.
Yeah, no, we definitely hear your concerns. Thank you. We want to consider both asset reuse and material reuse. Right now, staff concepts don't include guidance on that. We do have some concept proposed in the kind of how we may consider this based on the way Calgreen defines it right now, kind of how they are considering it part of the embodied carbon measures. We have that part of our reporting requirements that we've posted on the program website. So please take a look. But all to say, we are not necessarily including that as a separate thing, or we haven't identified a specific methodology on how you would account for a new material versus a reused material versus if it's been transported from site A to site B, or if it's been refurbished and things like that. There's lots of layers to that, obviously. There's written comments on that, but I think both the piece of material reuse and asset reuse have a lot more nuance to it that we would love to dive into. Right now, we haven't proposed a clear methodology for that.
And I mean, I think it's also maybe something for us. We'd love more information on, experiences from folks with the use of that in new construction projects. I mean, I think we talked to, we've talked to municipalities who have a lot of existing building stock, San Francisco, for example, where perhaps there is a lot more asset reuse and building refurbishment of buildings. And in those particular cases, obviously, there's going to be strategies that they're going to focus on, which may or may not be the same that we would be focused on from a state level, looking at new construction primarily. So I think it's an important consideration that we'd like to know more about. So on the material focus side, I think that's a great question. I think, we definitely are interested in what on the prioritization of materials from the manufacturer reporting standpoint. And I think we said, in the morning session, we emphasized that the selection of material sectors was based on two categories, really the highest contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the existing focus of green procurement programs. And so I think that the part there is that a lot of those industries already have more expertise in developing or capacity to develop EPDs or other type, or do reporting in general on their greenhouse gas emissions. I think on the project side, there's a need to have a more holistic accounting of materials. I think we've obviously been, following work from CLF and others, and I think are acutely aware of the importance of some of these additional building elements, including interiors. And so I think, from a reporting standpoint, obviously we're interested in hearing, feedback on other material sectors that may or may not need support. But maybe that's also partly something that could be addressed in a strategy in the future. As I mentioned, strategies, we might be thinking about strategies broadly with respect to the availability of data on those. So as I said, I think more comments on that is very welcome.
Cool. There's one more question online. And then if you have any comments in the room, I think please put your name tags up. And if you are online, please raise your hand and we'll call on you to speak. The one question online is, I would like to hear more about how CARB sees basic reporting and whole building LCA aspects of reporting changing over time as the program progresses towards showing reductions. I think the answer is CARB does periodically go through and revises reporting requirements and the regulations. And so I think as we move into the phase of strategy development, and if we identify additional gaps or additional areas where reporting or something should change, then absolutely would be open to creating an additional rulemaking process to revise reporting requirements. Also, we are in the current reporting requirement phase. What we've presented here today are staff concepts. Again, these are not baked. This isn't a staff report yet. We don't have regulatory text that we've shared with anybody. So, this is a great public comment period to really help us inform and lock in, reported goals that we are happy with moving forward with into this 2026 kind of reporting season. I think with that, I don't think I'm seeing any hands raised online.
I just want to add then, because I see some before we move into these, just thinking about next steps, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Thinking about our regulatory process, obviously we're going to have a long public comment period after these materials. We've published a lot of materials. We know it's going to take time to digest, and we keep emphasizing it's beating the dead horse, so to speak, with respect to requesting written comments. I'm on bended knee. Please give us written comments. So when we move into next year, our goal is to hold another public workshop in the beginning of next year. At that point, our goal is to produce a draft regulation text as well as draft staff report. At that point, there would be another public comment period that would be opened when we would accept additional public comments and feedback on whatever draft we have come up with. So between now and then, we'll take in, the intention is of staff to take in the comments we receive, to integrate those comments and respond to them the best we can, provide integrate them into a new draft proposal, which we then would release for additional public feedback before it would go to consideration for the board. So this isn't the last time to weigh in by any stretch. And so I just think I want to emphasize that, there's going to be future opportunities to
and why it's called technical meeting. So this is the chance to brainstorm, give us ideas, and to your point, Hanjiro, I'm thinking if folks can give us solution, not just comments, but how can we make it better, or what are the data sources or additional things we should consider? Because comments just that we don't like it or we don't agree with it, it's not productive. I think it would be helpful to know if you don't like it, what else? What are the alternative ways, or what? That we can have a more fully fleshed out proposal, actual formal public comment process.
Yeah, public recommendations are welcome. I mean,
I think we're gonna jump to, I see Ignacio has his hand raised. Julie, if you would be able to unmute him. Oh. He's unmuted. Ignacio, you are unmuted. Go ahead with your comment.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Ignacio Valdivia, Sustainability Manager for Holiday Rock. I just want to say thank you to CARB staff for the opportunity to comment and for taking the time to address my questions on the chat. I want to emphasize the importance of building a program that is practical, data-driven, and scalable for the producers who already provide EPDs. Aligning with existing reporting systems will make compliance achievable without sacrificing data quality. I plan to submit written feedback to help refine the framework, but I want to stress that success will depend on the structure that recognizes the operational realities, cost, and technical demands of concrete production while maintaining high data integrity. Thank you so much for CARB staff for all your answers today.
Great. I'm seeing no more hands from online participants. So let's go ahead with Joseph.
Joseph with ERG. Just a couple of really quick comments on the timing considerations of the reporting requirement tied to building permit issuance, as we've been discussing, versus the actual emissions likely occurring later, in maybe years later. There might be a way to, if when you submit your report, you indicate the building permit entity and number, to circle back maybe through automated systems with those issuing authorities, so that when the building's constructed and completed, then you could assign the emissions to that year or some preceding year or something like that. Just something to think about to kind of fix that issue. And related to the B and C stage emissions, might be worth thinking about looking at time adjusted warming potentials to address that issue, that I know it's another area of complexity, which I hate to introduce to an already really complicated system, but it would address that issue. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. Definitely. We look forward to seeing more detail and methodological suggestions in writing. That'd be helpful. Yeah, go ahead.
Justin Kosher with Pima. To the extent the LCA requirements for buildings is being pursued to help inform your strategy, I think it's critical because it has the chance to fix what's wrong with a lot of current policy, which is it assumes that the entire burden falls on building product manufacturers to reach this goal, that somehow today's building materials are inherently the problem. I think what you'll find as you collect building level data is that for very similar size buildings, there can be vast disparities in their embodied carbon footprint, which means that there's a lot that can be done on the design and construction phase to reach your goals. So I defer to the experts in the room on the data collection, but I think this is critical because it will inform better strategies and not assume that it's the building product manufacturer's responsibility to cut emissions by 40%.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I'd also put a plug in for Matt Roberts' work that we are contracting with at UC Berkeley. They are hoping to do some research into that space to identify some strategies on that side as well. Thanks, Chad.
Thanks, Chad E.B. Taylor Morrison. I know we are talking a lot about reporting today, but I did just want to also bring up on the goals and meeting the thresholds for 2030. I'm starting to get already a little nervous about that just because our ship is a big ship and it's hard to turn. And I'm thinking about, all the work. Like first we have to set a baseline. Then we have to, we have to start researching all the levers that we can pull. Then we have to start looking at the levers and which combination will get us there the most cost-effective way. And then we have to implement them in a project. And sometimes our projects, can go, we have projects that go 10, 15 years. And then it's very difficult to rescope in the middle of those projects. So I just want to bring that up as a potential thing to start talking about as well.
Yeah, thank you. We are very aware of the slow-moving ship. That's also why, we are hoping to have a reporting regulation adopted by the board starting in 2026.
I think, we have a statutory date of 2035. That's the target, which is very close in with respect to construction projects, right? Particularly for folks who work on construction projects, that's very soon. So I think that's a challenge, and I think that underpins why we're trying to move as quickly as we can on developing the reporting regulation to signal, and as quickly as we can the intentions here. And that, and that's why we're presenting these concepts. I just want to plug, these just really great discussion today. I really appreciate it. And these comments, I think a lot of comments deserve a deeper dive. And I just want to plug that, please, we're very interested in holding additional stakeholder meetings. If you have, you want to, if there's any concern in submitting things in writing, or you just like to have a more deep discussion with staff, please reach out to us. Now that we have these concepts out there, I think it's a great opportunity, even after the public comment period for this particular meeting but to meet directly. I think over the next month or so while the comment period is open, we're particularly interested in meeting with entities that may have specific feedback or specific input, because we are trying to move as quickly as possible to ensure that we can be providing certainty. So like I said, if you're willing to, we're very interested in holding additional stakeholder meetings, and we'll be happy to be available. So.
Just something you said, Chad, reminded me, for the builders here, it would be really interesting if while you're submitting comments that you could include information about like what the time horizons are, say on average or in extremes, what the causes of those, delays or timelines might be, how much of those are or are not under your control. So just a plug for another thing that would be really interesting to receive feedback on.
I see we're close to time, but there's one more comment here in the room. Oh, and Matt. Okay, two more comments in the room.
Let's go to Matt. I think I saw his card raised first.
Okay, because Jeff did it. My name is Matt Roberts. I lead the life cycle assessment and embodied carbon research at the Center for the Built Environment at UC Berkeley. As part of that, we're doing a project with CARB looking at the impact reduction strategies for the built environment, both from a demand side and supply side perspective. Through that project, so in addition to the public comment period for this workshop, we're running a survey to gather risks, barriers, and opportunities to decarbonization as faced by industry right now. So if you're touching the building in any way, shape, or form, come reach out to me, come chat to me or whatever, or look for that survey online. You can find it through like my profile, and I'm happy to share it around with you. We're also running a series of workshops. So if you're interested in getting involved in that project and sharing your perspectives to help inform the research and the strategies and recommendations we're going to be proposing as part of that research, feel free to come talk to me.
Awesome. Great. It looks like there's no further comments online or in the room. So we'll move to our handful of closing slides and next steps, which are largely a repeat from earlier this morning.
Yeah. Do you want to skip ahead? Yes, I think. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Before we conclude this section of today's meeting, we would like to review where we are in the process and the next steps. I understand this is probably repetitive for folks who were there in the morning, but we just want to close this out and tie a nice ribbon on it. In September, staff held a technical meeting on baseline estimation, which can be reviewed in past meeting materials using the link on the previous slide. This morning's workshop focused on reporting requirements for building materials reporting. Staff plan to review all feedback on the materials presented today. This feedback will be used to update the reporting templates presented today, as well as inform the regulatory text. A draft staff report will be released prior to a third public workshop, which will be announced via the Gov delivery system. Please sign up for the Embodied Carbon mailing list for more information on these meetings if you're not already subscribed. And finally, let's recap the program timeline. The release of the draft regulatory text and the third public workshop are planned for early 2026, with a target board hearing date of May 2026. The reporting regulation is slated to come into effect at the beginning of 2027. This concludes the afternoon session of this technical meeting. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
If anyone did not sign in on the sheet on your way in, if you could just come make sure somebody knows that you're here, that would be awesome.